Next time I saw my partner, I said, "Now, come on, be honest and tell me the truth. Where'd you go when you went to see that battle?" He says, "I went down in the hold." All through that fight, I was scared nearly to death. I hardly knew anything. I was so frightened, but you see, nobody knew that but me. Next day, General Polk sent for me and praised me for my bravery and gallant conduct. I never said anything. I let it go at that. I judged it wasn't so, but it was not for me to contradict a general officer. Pretty soon after that, I was sick and used up and had to go off to the hot springs. When there, I had a good many letters from commanders saying they wanted me to come back. I declined because I wasn't well enough or strong enough. But I kept still and kept the reputation I'd made. A plain story, straightforwardly told. But Mumford told me that that pilot had gilded that scare of his in spots, that his subsequent career in the war was proof of it. We struck down through the chute of Island No. 8, and I went below and fell into conversation with a passenger, a handsome man with easy carriage and an intelligent face. We were approaching Island No. 10, a place so celebrated during the war. This gentleman's home was on the main shore in its neighborhood. I had some talk with him about the war times, but presently the discourse fell upon feuds, for in no part of the South has the vendetta flourished more briskly, or held out longer between warring families than this particular region. This gentleman said, "There's been more than one feud around here in the old times, but I reckon the first one was between the Darnells and the Watsons. Nobody don't know now what the first quarrel was about, it's so long ago. The Darnells and the Watsons don't know if there's any of 'em living, which I don't think there is. Some says it was about a horse or a cow. Anyway, it was a little matter. The money in it wasn't of no consequence. None in the world. Both families was rich. The thing could have been fixed up easy enough, but no, that wouldn't do. Rough words had been passed, and so nothing but blood could fix it up after that. That horse or cow, whichever it was, cost 60 years of killing or crippling. Every year or so somebody was shot on one side or the other, and as fast as one generation was laid out, their sons took up the feud and kept it a-going. And it's just as I say, they went on shooting each other year in and year out, making a kind of religion out of it, you see, till they'd done forgot long ago what it was all about. Wherever a Darnell caught a Watson, or a Watson caught a Darnell, one of 'em was going to get hurt. Only question was, which of 'em got the drop on the other? They'd shoot one another down right in the presence of the family. They didn't hunt for each other, but when they happened to meet, they pulled and begun. Men would shoot boys, boys would shoot men. A man shot a boy 12 years old, happened on him in the woods and didn't give him no chance. If he had given him a chance, the boy'd have shot him. Both families belonged to the same church. Everybody round here is religious. Through all this 50 or 60 years fuss, both tribes was there every Sunday to worship. They lived each side of the line, and the church was at a landing called Compromise. Half the church and half the aisle was in Kentucky, the other half in Tennessee. Sundays you'd see the families drive up, all in their Sunday clothes, men, women, and children, and file up the aisle and set down, quiet and orderly, one lot on the Tennessee side of the church and the other on the Kentucky side. And the men and boys would lean their guns up against the wall, handy, and then all hands had joined with the prayer and praise, though they say the man next the aisle didn't kneel down, along with the rest of the family, kind of stood guard. I don't know, never was at that church in my life, but I remember that's what used to be said. 20 or 25 years ago, one of the feud families caught a young man of 19 out and killed him. Don't remember whether it was the Darnells and Watsons or one of the other feuds, but anyway, this young man rode up, steamboat laying there all the time, and the first thing he saw was a whole gang of the enemy. He jumped down behind a woodpile, but they rode around and begun on him, he firing back, and they galloping and cavorting and yelling and banging away with all their might. Think he wounded a couple of 'em, but they closed in on him and chased him into the river, and as he swum along downstream, they followed along the bank and kept on shooting at him. And when he struck shore, he was dead. Windy Marshall told me about it. He saw it. He was captain of the boat. Years ago, the Darnells was so thinned out that the old man and his 2 sons concluded they'd leave the country. They started to take steamboat just above number 10, but the Watsons got wind of it, and they arrived just as the 2 young Darnells was walking up the companionway with their wives on their arms. The fight begun then, and they never got no further, both of 'em killed. After that, old Darnell got into trouble with the man that run the ferry, and the ferryman got the worst of it and died. But his friends shot old Darnell through and through, filled him full of bullets, and ended him. The country gentleman who told me these things had been reared in ease and comfort, was a man of good parts, and was college-bred. His loose grammar was the fruit of careless habit, not ignorance. This habit among educated men in the West is not universal, but it is prevalent. Prevalent in the towns, certainly, if not in the cities, and to a degree which one cannot help noticing and marveling at. I heard a Westerner, who would be accounted a highly educated man in any country, say, "Never mind, it don't make no difference anyway." A lifelong resident who was present heard it, but it made no impression upon her. She was able to recall the fact afterward when reminded of it, but she confessed that the words had not grated upon her ear at the time, a confession which suggests that if educated people can hear such blasphemous grammar from such a source, and be unconscious of the deed, the crime must be tolerably common. So common that the general ear has become dulled by familiarity with it, and is no longer alert, no longer sensitive to such affronts. No one in the world speaks blemishless grammar. No one has ever written it. No one, either in the world or out of it, taking the Scriptures for evidence on the latter point. Therefore, it would not be fair to exact grammatical perfection from the peoples of the valley, but they and all other peoples may justly be required to refrain from knowingly and purposely debauching their grammar. I found the river greatly changed at island number 10. The island which I remembered was some 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide, heavily timbered, and lay near the Kentucky shore, within 200 yards of it, I should say. Now, however, one had to hunt for it with a spyglass. Nothing was left of it but an insignificant little tuft, and this was no longer near the Kentucky shore. It was clear over against the opposite shore, a mile away. In war times, the island had been an important place, for it commanded the situation, and being heavily fortified, there was no getting by it. It lay between the upper and lower divisions of the Union forces, and kept them separate until a junction was finally effected across the Missouri neck of land. But the island, being itself joined to that neck now, the wide river is without obstruction. In this region, the river passes from Kentucky into Tennessee, back into Missouri, then back into Kentucky, and thence into Tennessee again. So a mile or two of Missouri sticks over into Tennessee. The town of New Madrid was looking very unwell, but otherwise unchanged from its former condition and aspect. Its blocks of frame houses were still grouped in the same old flat plain, and environed by the same old forests. It was as tranquil as formerly, and apparently had neither grown nor diminished in size. It was said that the recent high water had invaded it and damaged its looks. This was surprising news, for in low water the river bank is very high there, 50 feet, and in my day an overflow had always been considered an impossibility. This present flood of 1882 will doubtless be celebrated in the river's history for several generations before a deluge of like magnitude shall be seen. It put all the unprotected lowlands under water from Cairo to the mouth. It broke down the levees in a great many places on both sides of the river, and in some regions south, when the flood was at its highest, the Mississippi was 70 miles wide. A number of lives were lost, and the destruction of property was fearful. The crops were destroyed, houses washed away, and shelterless men and cattle forced to take refuge on scattering elevations here and there, in field and forest, and wait in peril and suffering until the boats put in commission by the national and local governments, and by newspaper enterprise, could come and rescue them. The properties of multitudes of people were under water, for months, and the poorer ones must have starved by the hundred if succor had not been promptly afforded. The water had been falling during a considerable time now, yet, as a rule, we found the banks still under water. Chapter 27. Some Imported Articles. We met 2 steamboats at New Madrid. 2 steamboats in sight at once, an infrequent spectacle now in the lonesome Mississippi. The loneliness of this solemn, stupendous flood is impressive and depressing. League after league, and still league after league, it pours its chocolate tide along between its solid forest walls, its almost untenanted shores, with seldom a sail or a moving object of any kind to disturb the surface and break the monotony of the blank, watery solitude. And so the day goes, the night comes, and again the day, and still the same, night after night and day after day, majestic, unchanging sameness of serenity, repose, tranquility, lethargy, vacancy, symbol of eternity, realization of the heaven pictured by priest and prophet, and longed for by the good and thoughtless. Immediately after the War of 1812, tourists began to come to America, from England. Scattering ones at first, then a sort of procession of them, a procession which kept up its plodding, patient march through the land during many, many years. Each tourist took notes and went home and published a book which was usually calm, truthful, reasonable, kind, but which seemed just the reverse to our tender-footed progenitors. A glance at these tourist books shows us that in certain of its aspects the Mississippi has undergone no change since those strangers visited it, but remains today about as it was then. The emotions produced in those foreign breasts by these aspects were not all formed on one pattern, of course. They had to be various, along at first, because the earlier tourists were obliged to originate their emotions, whereas in older countries one can always borrow emotions from one's predecessors. And mind you, emotions are among the toughest things in the world to manufacture out of whole cloth. It is easier to manufacture 7 facts than 1 emotion. Captain Basil Hall, R.N., writing 55 years ago, says, "Here I caught the first glimpse of the object I had so long wished to behold, and felt myself amply repaid at that moment for all the trouble I had experienced in coming so far, and stood looking at the river flowing past till it was too dark to distinguish anything. But it was not until I had visited the same spot a dozen times that I came to a right comprehension of the grandeur of the scene." Following are Mrs. Trollope's emotions. She is writing a few months later, in the same year, 1827, and is coming in at the mouth of the Mississippi. The first indication of our approach to land was the appearance of this mighty river pouring forth its muddy mass of waters and mingling with the deep blue of the Mexican Gulf. I never beheld a scene so utterly desolate as this entrance of the Mississippi. Had Dante seen it, he might have drawn images of another Bolgia from its horrors. One only object rears itself above the eddying waters. This is the mast of a vessel long since wrecked in attempting to cross the bar, and it still stands, a dismal witness of the destruction that has been, and a boding prophet of that which is to come. Emotions of the Honorable Charles Augustus Murray, near St. Louis, 7 years later. It is only when you ascend the mighty current for 50 or 100 miles, and use the eye of imagination as well as that of nature, that you begin to understand all his might and majesty. You see him fertilizing a boundless valley, bearing along in his course the trophies of his 1,000 victories over the shattered forest, here carrying away large masses of soil with all their growth, and there forming islands destined at some future period to be the residence of man. And while indulging in this prospect, It is then time for reflection to suggest that the current before you has flowed through 2,000 or 3,000 miles, and has yet to travel 1,300 more before reaching its ocean destination. Receive now the emotions of Captain Marryat, R.N., author of the Sea Tales, writing in 1837, 3 years after Mr. Murray. Never perhaps in the records of nations was there an instance of a century of such unvarying and unmitigated crime as is to be collected from the history of the turbulent and blood-stained Mississippi. The stream itself appears as if appropriate for the deeds which have been committed. It is not like most rivers, beautiful to the sight, bestowing fertility in its course. Not one that the eye loves to dwell upon as it sweeps along, nor can you wander upon its bank, or trust yourself without danger to its stream. It is a furious, rapid, desolating torrent, loaded with alluvial soil, and few of those who are received into its waters ever rise again, or can support themselves long upon its surface, without assistance from some friendly log. There was a foolish superstition of some little prevalence in that day, that the Mississippi would neither buoy up a swimmer, nor permit a drowned person's body to rise to the surface. It contains the coarsest and most uneatable of fish, such as catfish and such genus, and as you descend, its banks are occupied with the fetid alligator, while the panther basks at its edge in the cane-brakes, almost impervious to man. Pouring its impetuous waters through wild tracts covered with trees of little value except for firewood, it sweeps down whole forests in its course, which disappear in tumultuous confusion, whirled away by the stream now loaded with the masses of soil which nourished their roots, often blocking up and changing for a time the channel of the river, which, as if in anger at its being opposed, inundates and devastates the whole country round, and as soon as it forces its way through its former channel, plants in every direction the uprooted monarchs of the forest, upon whose branches the bird will never again perch, or the raccoon, the opossum, or the squirrel climb, as traps to the adventurous navigators of its waters by steam, who, borne away by these concealed dangers which pierce through the planks, very often have not time to steer for and gain the shore before they sink to the bottom. There are no pleasing associations connected with the great common sewer of the Western America, which pours out its mud into the Mexican Gulf, polluting the clear blue sea for miles beyond its mouth. It is a river of desolation, and instead of reminding you, like other beautiful rivers, of an angel which has descended for the benefit of man, you imagine it a devil whose energies have been only overcome by the wonderful power of steam. It's pretty crude literature for a man accustomed to handling a pen. Still, as a panorama of the emotions sent weltering through this noted visitor's breast by the aspect and traditions of the great common sewer, it has a value. A value, though, marred in the matter of statistics by inaccuracies. For the catfish is plenty good enough fish for anybody, and there are no panthers that are impervious to man. Later still comes Alexander Mackey, of the Middle Temple, barrister at law, with a better digestion and no catfish dinner aboard, and feels as follows. The Mississippi. It was with indescribable emotions that I first felt myself afloat upon its waters. How often in my schoolboy dreams, and in my waking visions afterward, had my imagination pictured to itself the lordly stream, rolling with tumultuous current through the boundless region to which it has given its name, and gathering into itself in its course to the ocean the tributary waters of almost every latitude in the temperate zone. Here it was, then, in its reality, and I, at length, steaming against its tide. I looked upon it with that reverence with which everyone must regard a great feature of external nature. So much for the emotions. The tourists, one and all, remark upon the deep, brooding loneliness and desolation of the vast river. Captain Basil Hall, who saw it at flood stage, says, Sometimes we passed along distances of 20 or 30 miles without seeing a single habitation. An artist, in search of hints for a painting of the deluge, would here have found them in abundance. The first shall be last, etc. Just 200 years ago, the old, original, first and gallantest of all the foreign tourists, pioneers, head of the procession, ended his weary and tedious discovery voyage down the solemn stretches of the great river, La Salle, whose name will last as long as the river itself shall last. We quote from Mr. Parkman. And now they neared their journey's end. On the 6th of April, the river divided itself into 3 broad channels. La Salle followed that of the west, and Dautre that of the east, while Tonty took the middle passage. As he drifted down the turbid current, between the low and marshy shores, the brackish water changed to brine, and the breeze grew fresh with the salt breath of the sea. Then the broad bosom of the great gulf opened on his sight, tossing its restless billows, limitless, voiceless, lonely as when born of chaos, without a sail, without a sign of life. Then, on a spot of solid ground, La Salle reared a column, bearing the arms of France. The Frenchmen were mustered under arms, and while the New England Indians and their squaws looked on in wondering silence, they chanted the Te Deum, the Exaudiat, and the Domine Salvum Fac Regem. Then, while the musketry volleyed and rejoicing shouts burst forth, the victorious discoverer planted the column and made proclamation in a loud voice, taking formal possession of the river and the vast countries watered by it, in the name of the king. The column bore this inscription in French: Louis the Great, King of France and Navarre, now reigning, the 9th of April, 1682. New Orleans intended to fittingly celebrate this present year, the bicentennial anniversary of this illustrious event, but when the time came, all her energies and surplus money were required in other directions, for the flood was upon the land then, making havoc and devastation everywhere. Chapter 28. Uncle Mumford Unloads. All day we swung along down the river, and had the stream almost wholly to ourselves. Formerly, at such a stage of water, we should have passed acres of lumber rafts and dozens of big coal barges, also occasional little trading scows, peddling along from farm to farm with the peddler's family on board, possibly a random scow bearing a humble Hamlet and company on an itinerant dramatic trip. But these were all absent. Far along in the day we saw one steamboat, just one, within the wooded mouth of the Obion River. The spyglass revealed the fact that she was named for me, or he was named for me, whichever you prefer. As this was the first time I had ever encountered this species of honor, it seems excusable to mention it, and at the same time call the attention of the authorities to the tardiness of my recognition of it. Noted a big change in the river at Island 21. It was a very large island, and used to lie out toward midstream, but it is joined fast to the main shore now, and has retired from business as an island. As we approached famous and formidable Plum Point, darkness fell. But that was nothing to shudder about, in these modern times. For now, the national government has turned the Mississippi into a sort of 2,000-mile torchlight procession. In the head of every crossing, and in the foot of every crossing, the government has set up a clear burning lamp. You are never entirely in the dark now. There is always a beacon in sight, either before you or behind you, or abreast. One might almost say that lamps have been squandered there. Dozens of crossings are lighted, which were not shoal when they were created, and have never been shoal since. Crossings so plain, too, and also so straight, that a steamboat can take herself through them without any help, after she's been through once. Lamps in such places are, of course, not wasted. It's much more convenient and comfortable for a pilot to hold on them than on a spread of formless blackness that won't stay still. And money is saved to the boat at the same time, for she can, of course, make more miles from her rudder amidships than she can with it squared across her stern and holding her back. But this thing has knocked the romance out of piloting to a large extent. It and some other things together have knocked all the romance out of it. For instance, the peril from snags is not now what it once was. The government's snag boats go patrolling up and down in these matter-of-fact days, pulling the river's teeth. They've rooted out all the old clusters which made many localities so formidable, and they allow no new ones to collect. Formerly, if your boat got away from you on a black night and broke for the woods, it was an anxious time for you. So was it also when you were groping your way through solidified darkness in a narrow chute. But all that's changed now. You flash out your electric light, transform night into day in the twinkling of an eye, and your perils and anxieties are at an end. Horace Bixby and George Ritchie have charted the crossings and laid out the courses by compass. They've invented a lamp to go with the chart and have patented the whole. With these helps, one may run in the fog now with considerable security and with a confidence unknown in the old days. With these abundant beacons and the banishment of snags, plenty of daylight in a box and ready to be turned on whenever needed, and a chart compass to fight the fog with, piloting at a good stage of water is now nearly as safe and simple as driving stage, and is hardly more than 3 times as romantic. And now, in these days of infinite change, the anchor line have raised the captain above the pilot by giving him the bigger wages of the two. This was going far, but they have not stopped there. They have decreed that the pilot shall remain at his post and stand his watch clear through, whether the boat be under way or tied up to the shore. We that were once the aristocrats of the river can't go to bed now, as we used to do, and sleep while 100 tons of freight are lugged aboard. No, we must sit in the pilot-house and keep awake, too. Verily, we are being treated like a parcel of mates and engineers. The government has taken away the romance of our calling. The company has taken away its state and dignity. Plum Point looked as it had always looked at night, with the exception that now there were beacons to mark the crossings, and also a lot of other lights on the point and along its shore, these latter glinting from the fleet of the United States River Commission and from a village which the officials have built on the land for offices and for the employees of the service. The military engineers of the Commission have taken upon their shoulders the job of making the Mississippi over again, a job transcended in size by only the original job of creating it. They are building wing dams here and there to deflect the current, and dikes to confine it in narrower bounds, and other dikes to make it stay there. And for unnumbered miles along the Mississippi they are felling the timber front for 50 yards back, with the purpose of shaving the bank down to low water mark with the slant of a house roof, and ballasting it with stones. And in many places they have protected the wasting shores with rows of piles. One who knows the Mississippi will promptly aver, not out loud but to himself, that 10,000 river commissions, with the minds of the world at their back, cannot tame that lawless stream, cannot curb it or confine it, cannot say to it, "Go here," or "Go there," and make it obey, cannot save a shore which it has sentenced, cannot bar its path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over, and laugh at. But a discreet man will not put these things into spoken words, for the West Point engineers have not their superiors anywhere. They know all that can be known of their abstruse science, and so, since they conceive that they can fetter and handcuff that river and boss him, it is but wisdom for the unscientific man to keep still, lie low, and wait until they do it. Captain Eads, with his jetties, has done a work at the mouth of the Mississippi which seemed clearly impossible. So we do not feel full confidence now to prophesy against like impossibilities. Otherwise, one would pipe out and say the Commission might as well bully the comets in their courses, and undertake to make them behave, as to try to bully the Mississippi into right and reasonable conduct. I consulted Uncle Mumford concerning this and cognate matters, and I give here the result, stenographically reported, and therefore to be relied on as being full and correct. except that I have here and there left out remarks which were addressed to the men, such as, "Where in blazes are you going with that barrel now?" and which seemed to me to break the flow of the written statement, without compensating by adding to its information or its clearness. Not that I have ventured to strike out all such interjections. I have removed only those which were obviously irrelevant. Wherever one occurred which I felt any question about, I have judged it safest to let it remain. Uncle Mumford said, "As long as I've been mate of a steamboat, 30 years, I've watched this river and studied it. Maybe I could have learned more about it at West Point, but if I believe it, I wish I may be—" "What are you sucking your fingers there for? Collar that keg of nails!" 4 years at West Point, and plenty of books in school, and it'll learn a man a good deal, I reckon. But it won't learn him the river. You turn one of those little European rivers over to this commission with its hard bottom and clear water, and it'd just be a holiday job for them to wall it and pile it and dike it and tame it down and boss it around and make it go wherever they wanted to and stay where they put it and do just as they said every time. But this ain't that kind of river. They started in here with big confidence and the best intentions in the world, but they're going to get left. What does Ecclesiastes 7:13 say? Says enough to knock their little game galley west, don't it? Now you look at their methods once. They're at Devil's Island in the upper river. They wanted the river to go one way, water wanted to go another. So they put up a stone wall. But what does a river care for a stone wall? When it got ready, it just bulged through it. Maybe they can build another that'll stay. That is, up there, but not down here they can't. Down here in the lower river, they drive some pegs to turn the water away from shore and stop it from slicing off the bank. Very well, don't it go straight over and cut somebody else's bank? Certainly. And they're going to peg all the banks? Why, they could buy ground and build a new Mississippi cheaper. They're pegging Bullet and Towhead now. It won't do any good. If the river's got a mortgage on that island, it'll foreclose, sure, pegs or no pegs. Away down yonder, they've driven 2 rows of piles straight through the middle of a dry bar 1/2 mile long, which is 40 foot out of the water when the river's low. What do you reckon that's for? If I know, I wish I may land you. Hump yourself, you son of an undertaker. Out with that coal oil now, lively, lively! And just look at what they're trying to do down there at Milliken's Bend. There's been a cut-off in that section, and Vicksburg is left out in the cold. It's a country town now. The river strikes in below it, and a boat can't go up to the town except in high water. Well, they're going to build wing dams in the bend opposite the foot of 103 and throw the water over and cut off the foot of the island and plow down into an old ditch where the river used to be in ancient times, and they think they can persuade the water around that way and get it to strike above Vicksburg, way it used to do, and fetch the town back into the world again. That is, they're going to take this whole Mississippi and twist it around and make it run several miles upstream. Well, you gotta admire a man that deal in ideas of that size and can tote 'em around without crutches. But you haven't got to believe they can do such miracles, have you? And you ain't absolutely obligated to believe they can't. I reckon the safe way, where a man can afford it, is to copper the operation and at the same time buy enough property in Vicksburg to square you up in case they win. Government's doing the deal for the Mississippi now, spending loads of money on her. When there used to be 4,000 steamboats and 10,000 acres of coal barges and rafts and trading scows, there wasn't a lantern from St. Paul to New Orleans, and the snags were thicker than bristles on a hog's back. And now, when there's 3 dozen steamboats and nary a barge or raft, government has snatched out all the snags and lit up the shores like Broadway, and the boat's as safe on the river as you'd be in heaven. And I reckon that by the time there ain't any boats left at all, the commission'll have the old thing all reorganized and dredged out and fenced in and tidied up to a degree that'll make navigation just simply perfect and absolutely safe and profitable. And all the days will be Sundays, and all the mates will be Sunday school. So what in the nation you fooling around there for? You sons of unrighteousness, heirs of perdition. Gonna be a year getting that hogshead ashore? During our trip to New Orleans and back, we had many conversations with rivermen, planters, journalists, and officers of the River Commission, with conflicting and confusing results. To wit, some believed in the Commission's scheme to arbitrarily and permanently confine, and thus deepen, the channel, preserve threatened shores, etc. Some believed that the Commission's money ought to be spent only on building and repairing the great system of levees. Some believed that the higher you build your levee, the higher the river's bottom will rise, and that consequently the levee system is a mistake. Some believed in the scheme to relieve the river in flood time by turning its surplus waters off into Lake Bourne, etc. Some believed in the scheme of northern lake reservoirs to replenish the Mississippi in low water seasons. Whenever you find a man down there who believes in one of these theories, you may turn to the next man and frame your talk upon the hypothesis that he does not believe in that theory. And after you have had experience, you do not take this course doubtfully or hesitatingly, but with the confidence of a dying murderer, converted one, I mean. For you'll have come to know, with a deep and restful certainty, that you're not going to meet two people sick of the same theory, one right after the other. No, there will always be one or two with the other diseases along between. And as you proceed, you'll find out one or two other things. You'll find out that there's no distemper of the lot but is contagious, and you can't go where it is without catching it. You may vaccinate yourself with deterrent facts as much as you please. It'll do no good. It'll seem to take, but it doesn't. The moment you rub against any one of those theorists, make up your mind that it's time to hang out your yellow flag. Yes, you're his sure victim. Yet his work's not all to your hurt, only part of it. For he's like your family physician, who comes and cures the mumps and leaves the scarlet fever behind. If your man's a lake-borne relief theorist, for instance, he'll exhale a cloud of deadly facts and statistics which lay you out with that disease, sure, but at the same time, he'll cure you of any other of the 5 theories that may have previously got into your system. I've had all the 5, and had them bad. But ask me not, in mournful numbers, which one racked me hardest, or which one numbered the biggest sick list, for I don't know. In truth, no one can answer the latter question. Mississippi improvement is a mighty topic down yonder. Every man on the riverbank south of Cairo talks about it every day during such moment as he's able to spare from talking about the war, and each of the several chief theories has its host of zealous partisans. But, as I've said, it's not possible to determine which cause numbers the most recruits. All were agreed on one point, however. If Congress would make a sufficient appropriation, a colossal benefit would result. Very well. Since then, the appropriation has been made. Possibly a sufficient one, certainly not too large a one. Let us hope that the prophecy will be amply fulfilled. One thing will be easily granted by the reader, that an opinion from Mr. Edward Atkinson upon any vast national commercial matter comes as near ranking as authority as the opinion of any individual in the Union. Sometimes half a dozen figures will reveal, as with a lightning flash, the importance of a subject which 10,000 labored words, with the same purpose in view, had left at last but dim and uncertain. Here's a case of the sort. Paragraph from the Cincinnati Commercial. The towboat Joseph B. Williams is on her way to New Orleans with a tow of 32 barges containing 600,000 bushels, 76 pounds to the bushel, of coal, exclusive of her own fuel, being the largest tow ever taken to New Orleans or anywhere else in the world. Her freight bill, at 3 cents a bushel, amounts to $18,000. It would take 1,800 cars of 333 bushels to the car to transport this amount of coal. At $10 per ton, or $100 a car, which would be a fair price for the distance by rail, the freight bill would amount to $180,000, or $162,000 more by rail than by river. The tow will be taken from Pittsburgh to New Orleans in 14 or 15 days. It would take 100 trains of 18 cars to the train to transport this one tow of 600,000 bushels of coal, and even if it made the usual speed of fast freight lines, it would take one whole summer to put it through by rail. When a river in good condition can enable one to save $162,000 and a whole summer's time on a single cargo, the wisdom of taking measures to keep the river in good condition is made plain to even the uncommercial mind. Chapter 29. A few specimen bricks. We passed through the Plum Point region, turned Craighead's Point, and glided unchallenged by what was once the formidable Fort Pillow, memorable because of the massacre perpetrated there during the war. Massacres are sprinkled with some frequency through the histories of several Christian nations, but this is almost the only one that can be found in American history. Perhaps it is the only one which rises to a size correspondent to that huge and somber title. We have the Boston Massacre, where 2 or 3 people were killed, but we must bunch Anglo-Saxon history together to find the fellow to the Fort Pillow tragedy. And doubtless even then we must travel back to the days and the performances of Coeur de Lion, that fine hero, before we accomplish it. More of the river's freaks. In times past, the channel used to strike above Island 37 by Brandywine Bar, and down toward Island 39. Afterward, changed its course and went from Brandywine down through Vogelman's Chute to the Devil's Elbow to Island 39. Part of this course reversing the old order, the river running up 4 or 5 miles instead of down, and cutting off throughout some 15 miles of distance. This in 1876. All that region is now called Centennial Island. There is a tradition that Island 37 was one of the principal abiding places of the once celebrated Morell's gang. This was a colossal combination of robbers, horse thieves, Negro stealers, and counterfeiters engaged in business along the river some 50 or 60 years ago. While our journey across the country toward St. Louis was in progress, we'd had no end of Jesse James and his stirring history, for he'd just been assassinated by an agent of the governor in Missouri, and was, in consequence, occupying a good deal of space in the newspapers. Cheap histories of him were for sale by train boys. According to these, he was the most marvelous creature of his kind that ever existed. It was a mistake. Morell was his equal in boldness, in pluck, in rapacity, in cruelty, brutality, heartlessness, treachery, and in general and comprehensive vileness and shamelessness, and very much his superior in some larger aspects. James was a retail rascal, Morell wholesale. James's modest genius dreamed of no loftier flight than the planning of raids upon cars, coaches, and country banks. Morell projected Negro insurrections and the capture of New Orleans. And furthermore, on occasion, this Morell could go into a pulpit and edify the congregation. What are James and his half-dozen vulgar rascals compared with this stately old-time criminal, with his sermons, his meditated insurrections and city captures, and his majestic following of 1,000 men, sworn to do his evil will? Here's a paragraph or two concerning this big operator from a now-forgotten book which was published half a century ago. He appears to have been a most dexterous as well as consummate villain. When he traveled, his usual disguise was that of an itinerant preacher, and it is said that his discourses were very soul-moving, interesting the hearers so much that they forgot to look after their horses, which were always carried away by his confederates while he was preaching. But the stealing of horses in one state and selling them in another was but a small portion of their business. The most lucrative was the enticing slaves to run away from their masters, that they might sell them in another quarter. This was arranged as follows. They would tell a Negro that if he would run away from his master and allow them to sell him, he should receive a portion of the money paid for him, and that upon his return to them a second time, they would send him to a free state, where he would be safe. The poor wretches complied with this request, hoping to obtain money and freedom. They would be sold to another master and run away again to their employers. Sometimes they would be sold in this manner 3 or 4 times, until they had realized $3,000 or $4,000 by them. But as, after this, there was fear of detection, the usual custom was to get rid of the only witness that could be produced against them, which was the Negro himself, by murdering him and throwing his body into the Mississippi. Even if it was established that they had stolen a Negro before he was murdered, they were always prepared to evade punishment, for they concealed the Negro who had run away until he was advertised and a reward offered to any man who would catch him. An advertisement of this kind warrants the person to take the property if found, and then the Negro becomes a property in trust. When, therefore, they sold the Negro, it only became a breach of trust, not stealing. And for a breach of trust the owner of the property can only have redress by a civil action, which was useless, as the damages were never paid. It may be inquired how it was that Morrell escaped lynch law under such circumstances. This will be easily understood when it's stated that he had more than 1,000 sworn Confederates, all ready at a moment's notice to support any of the gang who might be in trouble. The names of all the principal Confederates of Morrell were obtained from himself, in a manner which I shall presently explain. The gang was composed of 2 classes: the heads, or council, as they were called, who planned and concerted but seldom acted. They amounted to about 400. The other class were the active agents, and were termed strikers, and amounted to about 650. These were the tools in the hands of the others. They ran all the risk, and received but a small portion of the money. They were in the power of the leaders of the gang, who would sacrifice them at any time by handing them over to justice, or sinking their bodies in the Mississippi. The general rendezvous of this gang of miscreants was on the Arkansas side of the river, where they concealed their Negroes in the morasses and canebrakes.
This ends Disc 6. Life on the Mississippi, Disc 7.
The depredations of this extensive combination were severely felt, but so well were the plans arranged that, although Morrell, who was always active, was everywhere suspected, there was no proof to be obtained. It so happened, however, that a young man of the name of Stewart, who was looking after 2 slaves which Morrell had decoyed away, fell in with him and obtained his confidence, took the oath, and was admitted into the gang as one of the general council. By this means all was discovered, for Stewart turned traitor, although he had taken the oath, and having obtained every information, exposed the whole concern, the names of all the parties, and finally succeeded in bringing home sufficient evidence against Morrell to procure his conviction and sentence to the penitentiary. Morrell was sentenced to 14 years' imprisonment. So many people who were supposed to be honest and bore a respectable name in the different states were found to be among the list of the Grand Council as published by Stewart, that every attempt was made to throw discredit upon his assertions. His character was vilified, and more than one attempt was made to assassinate him. He was obliged to quit the southern states in consequence. It is, however, now well ascertained to have been all true, and although some blame Mr. Stewart for having violated his oath, they no longer attempt to deny that his revelations were correct. I will quote 1 or 2 portions of Morrell's confessions to Mr. Stewart, made to him when they were journeying together. I ought to have observed that the ultimate intentions of Morrell and his associates were, by his own account, on a very extended scale, having no less an object in view than raising the blacks against the whites, taking possession of and plundering New Orleans, and making themselves possessors of the territory. The following are a few extracts. I collected all my friends about New Orleans at one of our friends' houses in that place, and we sat in council 3 days before we got all our plans to our notion. We then determined to undertake the rebellion at every hazard, and make as many friends as we could for that purpose, every man's business being assigned to him. I started to Natchez on foot, having sold my horse in New Orleans, with the intention of stealing another after I started. I walked 4 days, and no opportunity offered for me to get a horse. The 5th day, about 12, I'd become tired and stopped at a creek to get some water and rest for a while. While I was sitting on a log, looking down the road the way that I come, a man come in sight riding on a good-looking horse. Very moment I saw him, I was determined to have his horse, if he was in the garb of a traveler. He rode up, and I saw from his equipage that he was a traveler. I rose and drew an elegant rifle pistol on him and ordered him to dismount. He did so, and I took his horse by the bridle and pointed down the creek and ordered him to walk before me. He went a few hundred yards and stopped. I hitched his horse and then made him undress himself, all to his shirt and drawers, and ordered him to turn his back to me. He said, "If you're determined to kill me, let me have time to pray before I die." I told him I had no time to hear him pray. He turned around and dropped on his knees, and I shot him through the back of the head. I ripped open his belly and took out his entrails and sunk him in the creek. I then searched his pockets and found $400.37 and a number of papers that I did not take time to examine. I sunk the pocketbook and papers and his hat in the creek. His boots were brand new and fitted me genteelly. Then I put 'em on and sunk my old shoes in the creek to atone for them. I rolled up his clothes and put 'em into his portmanteau, as they were brand new cloth and the best of quality. I mounted as fine a horse as ever I straddled, and directed my course for Natchez in much better style than I had been for the last 5 days. Myself and a fellow named Crenshaw gathered 4 good horses and started for Georgia. We got in company with a young South Carolinian just before we got to Cumberland Mountain, and Crenshaw soon knew all about his business. He'd been to Tennessee to buy a drove of hogs, but when he got there, pork was dearer than he calculated, and he declined purchasing. We concluded he was a prize. Crenshaw winked at me. I understood his idea. Crenshaw had traveled the road before, but I never had. We had traveled several miles on the mountain when we passed a great precipice. Just before we passed it, Crenshaw asked me for my whip, which had a pound of lead in the butt. I handed it to him, and he rode up by the side of the South Carolinian and gave him a blow on the side of the head and tumbled him from his horse. We lit from our horses and fingered his pockets. We got $1,262. Crenshaw said he knew a place to hide him, and he gathered him under his arms and I by his feet and conveyed him to a deep crevice in the brow of a precipice and tumbled him into it. And he went out of sight. We then tumbled in his saddle and took his horse with us, which was worth $200. We were detained a few days, and during that time our friend went to a little village in the neighborhood and saw the Negro advertised, a Negro in our possession, and a description of the 2 men of whom he'd been purchased, and given his suspicions of the men. It was rather squally times, but any port in a storm. We took the Negro that night on the bank of a creek which runs by the farm of our friend, and Crenshaw shot him through the head. We took out his entrails and sunk him in the creek. He had sold the other Negro the 3rd time on Arkansas River for upward of $500, and then stole him and delivered him into the hand of his friend, who conducted him to a swamp and veiled the tragic scene, and got the last gleanings and sacred pledge of secrecy, as a game of that kind will not do unless it ends in a mystery to all but the fraternity. He sold the Negro, first and last, for nearly $2,000, and then put him forever out of reach of all pursuers. And they can never graze him unless they can find the Negro, and that they cannot do. For his carcass has fed many a tortoise and catfish before this time, and the frogs have sung this many a long day to the silent repose of his skeleton. We were approaching Memphis, in front of which city, and witnessed by its people, was fought the most famous of the river battles of the Civil War. 2 men whom I had served under in my river days took part in that fight: Mr. Bixby, head pilot of the Union fleet, and Montgomery, Commodore of the Confederate fleet. Both saw a great deal of active service during the war, and achieved high reputations for pluck and capacity. As we neared Memphis, we began to cast about for an excuse to stay with the Gold Dust to the end of her course, Vicksburg. We were so pleasantly situated that we did not wish to make a change. I had an errand of considerable importance to do at Napoleon, Arkansas, but perhaps I could manage it without quitting the Gold Dust. I said as much, so we decided to stick to our present quarters. The boat was to tarry at Memphis till 10 the next morning. It was a beautiful city, nobly situated on a commanding bluff overlooking the river. The streets are straight and spacious, though not paved in a way to incite distempered admiration. No, the admiration must be reserved for the town's sewerage system, which is called perfect. A recent reform, however, for it was just the other way up to a few years ago, a reform resulting from the lesson taught by a desolating visitation of the yellow fever. In those awful days, the people were swept off by hundreds, by thousands, and so great was the reduction caused by flight and by death together, that the population was diminished 3/4, and so remained for a time. Business stood nearly still, and the streets bore an empty Sunday aspect. Here is a picture of Memphis at that disastrous time, drawn by a German tourist who seems to have been an eye-witness of the scenes which he described. It is from Chapter 7 of his book, just published in Leipzig, Mississippi Fahrten, von Ernst von Hesse-Wartegg. In August, the yellow fever had reached its extremest height. Daily, hundreds fell, a sacrifice to the terrible epidemic. The city was become a mighty graveyard. 2/3 of the population had deserted the place, and only the poor, the aged, and the sick remained behind, a sure prey for the insidious enemy. The houses were closed, little lamps burned in front of many, a sign that here death had entered. Often several lay dead in a single house. From the windows hung black crape. The stores were shut up, for their owners were gone away or dead. Fearful evil! In the briefest space it struck down and swept away even the most vigorous victim. A slight indisposition, then an hour of fever, then the hideous delirium, then the yellow death. On the street corners and in the squares lay sick men suddenly overtaken by the disease, and even corpses distorted and rigid. Food failed. Meat spoiled in a few hours in the fetid, pestiferous air and turned black. Fearful clamors issue from any houses. Then, after a season, they cease, and all is still. Noble self-sacrificing men come with the coffin, nail it up, and carry it away to the graveyard. In the night, stillness reigns. Only the physicians and the hearses hurry through the streets, and out of the distance, at intervals, comes the muffled thunder of the railway train, which, with the speed of the wind, as if hunted by furies, flies by the pest-ridden city without halting. But there is life enough there now. The population exceeds 40,000 and is augmenting, and trade is in a flourishing condition. We drove about the city, visited the park and the sociable horde of squirrels there, saw the fine residences, rose-clad and in other ways enticing to the eye, and got a good breakfast at the hotel. A thriving place is the Good Samaritan city of the Mississippi, has a great wholesale jobbing trade, foundries, machine shops, and manufactories of wagons, carriages, and cottonseed oil, and is shortly to have cotton mills and elevators. Her cotton receipts reached 500,000 bales last year, an increase of 60,000 over the year before. Out from her healthy commercial heart issue 5 trunk lines of railway, and a 6th is being added. This is a very different Memphis from the one which the vanished and unremembered procession of foreign tourists used to put into their books long time ago. In the days of the now forgotten, but once renowned and vigorously hated Mrs. Trollope, Memphis seems to have consisted mainly of one long street of log houses, with some outlying cabins sprinkled around rearward toward the woods, and now and then a pig and no end of mud. That was 55 years ago. She stopped at the hotel. Plainly, it was not the one which gave us our breakfast. She says, "The table was laid for 50 persons and was nearly full. They ate in perfect silence, and with such astonishing rapidity that their dinner was over literally before ours was begun. The only sounds heard were those produced by the knives and forks, with the unceasing chorus of coughing, etc. Coughing, etc. The etc. stands for an unpleasant word there, a word which she does not always charitably cover up, but sometimes prints. You will find it in the following description of a steamboat dinner, which she ate in company with a lot of aristocratic planters. Wealthy, well-born, ignorant swells they were, tinselled with the usual harmless military and judicial titles of that old day of cheap shams and windy pretense. The total want of all the usual courtesies of the table, the voracious rapidity with which the viands were seized and devoured, the strange uncouth phrases and pronunciation, the loathsome spitting, from the contamination of which it was absolutely impossible to protect our dresses, the frightful manner of feeding with their knives till the whole blade seemed to enter into the mouth, and the still more frightful manner of cleaning the teeth afterward with a pocket-knife, soon forced us to feel that we were not surrounded by the generals, colonels, and majors of the old world, and that the dinner hour was to be anything rather than an hour of enjoyment. Chapter 30. Sketches by the Way. It was a big river below Memphis, banks brimming full everywhere, and very frequently more than full, the waters pouring out over the land, flooding the woods and fields for miles into the interior, and in places to a depth of 15 feet. Signs all about of men's hard work gone to ruin, and all to be done over again with straitened means and a weakened courage. A melancholy picture, and a continuous one, hundreds of miles of it. Sometimes the beacon lights stood in water 3 feet deep, in the edge of dense forests, which extended for miles without farm, woodyard, clearing, or break of any kind, which meant that the keeper of the light must come in a skiff a great distance to discharge his trust, and often in desperate weather. Yet I was told that the work is faithfully performed in all weathers, and not always by men, sometimes by women, if the man is sick or absent. The government furnishes oil and pays $10 or $15 a month for the lighting and tending. A government boat distributes oil and pays wages once a month. The Ship Island region was as woodsy and tenantless as ever. The island has ceased to be an island, has joined itself compactly to the main shore, and wagons travel now where the steamboats used to navigate. No signs left of the wreck of the Pennsylvania. Some farmer will turn up her bones with his plow one day, no doubt, and be surprised. We were getting down now into the migrating Negro region. These poor people could never travel when they were slaves, so they make up for the privation now. They stay on a plantation till the desire to travel seizes them. Then they pack up, hail a steamboat, and clear out. Not for any particular place. No, nearly any place will answer. They only want to be moving. The amount of money on hand will answer the rest of the conundrum for them. If it will take them 50 miles, very well. Let it be 50. If not, a shorter flight will do. During a couple of days we frequently answered these hails. Sometimes there was a group of high-water stained, tumble-down cabins, populous with colored folk, and no whites visible, with grassless patches of dry ground here and there, a few felled trees, with skeleton cattle, mules and horses, eating the leaves and gnawing the bark, no other food for them in the flood-wasted land. Sometimes there was a single, lonely landing cabin. Near it, the colored family that had hailed us, little and big, old and young, roosting on the scant pile of household goods, these consisting of a rusty gun, some bed ticks, chests, tinware, stools, a crippled looking-glass, a venerable armchair, and 6 or 8 base-born and spiritless yellow curs attached to the family by strings. They must have their dogs, can't go without their dogs. Yet the dogs are never willing. They always object. So, one after another, in ridiculous procession, they are dragged aboard, all 4 feet braced and sliding along the stage, head likely to be pulled off. But the tugger, marching determinedly forward, bending to his work, with the rope over his shoulder for better purchase. Sometimes a child is forgotten and left on the bank, but never a dog. The usual river gossip going on in the pilot-house. Island number 63, an island with a lovely chute or passage behind it in the former times. They said Jesse Jameson of the Skylark had a visiting pilot with him one trip. A poor, old, broken-down, superannuated fellow left him at the wheel at the foot of 63 to run off the watch. The ancient mariner went up through the chute and down the river outside, and up the chute and down the river again, and yet again and again, and handed the boat over to the relieving pilot at the end of 3 hours of honest endeavor at the same old foot of the island where he had originally taken the wheel. A darky on shore, who had observed the boat go by about 13 times, said, "'Clar to gracious, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a whole line of them skylarks." Anecdote illustrative of influence of reputation in the changing of opinion. The Eclipse was renowned for her swiftness. One day she passed along. An old darky on shore, absorbed in his own matters, did not notice what steamer it was. Presently someone asked, "Any boat gone up?" "Yes, sir." "Was she going fast?" "Oh, so, loafing along." "Now, do you know what boat that was?" "No, sir." "Why, uncle, that was the Eclipse." "No, is that so? Well, I bet it was, 'cause she just went by here a-sparkling." Piece of history illustrative of the violent style of some of the people down along here. During the early weeks of high water, A's fence rails washed down on B's ground, and B's rails washed up in the eddy and landed on A's ground. A said, "Let the thing remain so. I will use your rails and you use mine." But B objected, wouldn't have it so. One day, A came down on B's ground to get his rails. B said, "I'll kill you," and proceeded for him with his revolver. A said, "I'm not armed." So B, who wished to do only what was right, threw down his revolver, then pulled a knife and cut A's throat all around, but gave his principal attention to the front and so failed to sever the jugular. Struggling around, A managed to get his hands on the discarded revolver and shot B dead with it, and recovered from his own injuries. Further gossip, after which everybody went below to get some afternoon coffee, and left me at the wheel alone. Something presently reminded me of our last hour in St. Louis, part of which I spent on this boat's hurricane deck, aft. I was joined there by a stranger who dropped into conversation with me, a brisk young fellow who said he was born in a town in the interior of Wisconsin and had never seen a steamboat until a week before. Also said that on the way down from La Crosse he had inspected and examined his boat so diligently, and with such passionate interest, that he had mastered the whole thing from steam to rudder blade. Asked me where I was from. I answered New England. "Oh, Yank," said he, and went chatting straight along without waiting for assent or denial. He immediately proposed to take me all over the boat and tell me the names of her different parts, and teach me their uses. Before I could enter a protest or excuse, he was already rattling glibly away at his benevolent work, and when I perceived that he was misnaming the things and inhospitably amusing himself at the expense of an innocent stranger from a far country, I held my peace and let him have his way. He gave me a world of misinformation, and the further he went, the wider his imagination expanded, and the more he enjoyed his cruel work of deceit. Sometimes, after palming off a particularly fantastic and outrageous lie upon me, he was so full of laugh that he had to step aside for a minute, upon one pretext or another, to keep me from suspecting. I stayed faithfully by him until his comedy was finished. Then he remarked that he had undertaken to learn me all about a steamboat, and had done it, but if he had overlooked anything, just ask him and he would supply the lack. "Anything about this boat that you don't know the name of or the purpose of, you come to me and I'll tell you." I said I would, and took my departure, disappeared, and approached him from another quarter, whence he could not see me. There he sat, all alone, doubling himself up and writhing this way and that, in the throes of unappeasable laughter. He must have made himself sick, for he was not publicly visible afterward for several days. Meantime, the episode dropped out of my mind. The thing that reminded me of it now, when I was alone at the wheel, was the spectacle of this young fellow standing in the pilot-house door, with the knob in his hand, silently and severely inspecting me. I don't know when I have seen anybody look so injured as he did. He did not say anything, simply stood there and looked, reproachfully looked and pondered. Finally, he shut the door and started away, halted on the Texas a minute, came back slowly, and stood in the door again, with that grieved look on his face, gazed upon me a while in meek rebuke, then said, "You let me learn you all about a steamboat, didn't you?" "Yes," I confessed. "Yes, you did, didn't you?" "Yes." "You are that fellow that... Language failed. Pause. Impotent struggle for further words. Then he gave it up, choked out a deep, strong oath, and departed for good. Afterward I saw him several times below during the trip, but he was cold, would not look at me. Idiot! If he had not been in such a sweat to play his witless, practical joke upon me in the beginning, I would have persuaded his thoughts into some other direction and saved him from that wanton and silly impoliteness. I had myself called with the 4 o'clock watch mornings, for one cannot see too many summer sunrises on the Mississippi. They're enchanting. First, there's the eloquence of silence, for a deep hush broods everywhere. Next, there's the haunting sense of loneliness, isolation, remoteness from the worry and bustle of the world. The dawn creeps in stealthily, the solid walls of black forest soften to gray, and vast stretches of the river open up and reveal themselves. The water is glass smooth, gives off spectral little wreaths of white mist. There's not the faintest breath of wind nor stir of leaf. The tranquility is profound and infinitely satisfying. Then a bird pipes up. Another follows, and soon the pipings develop into a jubilant riot of music. You see none of the birds. You simply move through an atmosphere of song which seems to sing itself. When the light has become a little stronger, you have one of the fairest and softest pictures imaginable. You have the intense green of the massed and crowded foliage nearby. You see it paling shade by shade in front of you. Upon the next projecting cape, a mile off or more, the tint has lightened to the tender young green of spring. The cape beyond that one has almost lost color, and the furthest one, miles away under the horizon, sleeps upon the water a mere dim vapor, and hardly separable from the sky above it and about it. And all this stretch of river is a mirror, and you have the shadowy reflections of the leafage and the curving shores and the receding capes pictured in it. Well, that is all beautiful, soft and rich and beautiful. And when the sun gets well up and distributes a pink flush here and a powder of gold yonder and a purple haze where it will yield the best effect, you grant that you have seen something that is worth remembering. We had the Kentucky Bend country in the early morning, scene of a strange and tragic accident in the old times. Captain Poe had a small stern-wheel boat, for years the home of himself and his wife. One night the boat struck a snag in the head of Kentucky Bend and sank with astonishing suddenness, water already well above the cabin floor when the captain got aft. So he cut into his wife's stateroom from above with an axe. She was asleep in the upper berth, the roof a flimsier one than was supposed. The first blow crashed down through the rotten boards and clove her skull. This bend is all filled up now, result of cut-off, and the same agent has taken the great and once much frequented Walnut Bend and set it away back in a solitude far from the accustomed track of passing steamers. Helena we visited, and also a town I had not heard of before, it being of recent birth, Arkansas City. It was born of a railway. The Little Rock, Mississippi River and Texas Railroad touches the river there. We asked a passenger who belonged there what sort of place it was. "Well," he said, after considering, and with the air of one who wishes to take time and be accurate, "it's a hell of a place." A description which was photographic for exactness. There were several rows and clusters of shabby frame houses, and a supply of mud sufficient to insure the town against a famine in that article for 100 years, for the overflow had but lately subsided. There were stagnant ponds in the streets here and there, and a dozen rude scows were scattered about, lying aground wherever they happened to have been when the waters drained off, and people could do their visiting and shopping on foot once more. Still, it is a thriving place, with a rich country behind it, an elevator in front of it, and also a fine big mill for the manufacture of cottonseed oil. I had never seen this kind of a mill before. Cottonseed was comparatively valueless in my time, but it is worth $12 or $13 a ton now, and none of it is thrown away. The oil made from it is colorless, tasteless, and almost, if not entirely, odorless. It is claimed that it can, by proper manipulation, be made to resemble and perform the office of any and all oils, and be produced at a cheaper rate than the cheapest of the originals. Sagacious people shipped it to Italy, doctored it, labeled it, and brought it back as olive oil. This trade grew to be so formidable that Italy was obliged to put a prohibitory impost upon it to keep it from working serious injury to her oil industry. Helena occupies one of the prettiest situations on the Mississippi. Her perch is the southernmost group of hills which one sees on that side of the river. In its normal condition, it is a pretty town, but the flood, or possibly the seepage, had lately been ravaging it. Whole streets of houses had been invaded by the muddy water, and the outsides of the buildings were still belted with a broad stain extending upward from the foundation. Stranded and discarded scows lay all about. Plank sidewalks on stilts 4 feet high were still standing. The broad sidewalks on the ground level were loose and ruinous. A couple of men trotting along them could make a blind man think a cavalry charge was coming. Everywhere the mud was black and deep, and in many places malarious pools of stagnant water were standing. A Mississippi inundation is the next most wasting and desolating infliction to a fire. We had an enjoyable time here on this sunny Sunday. 2 full hours' liberty ashore while the boat discharged freight. In the back streets but few white people were visible, but there were plenty of colored folk, mainly women and girls, and almost without exception upholstered in bright new clothes of swell and elaborate style and cut, a glaring and hilarious contrast to the mournful mud and the pensive puddles. Helena is the second town in Arkansas, in point of population, which is placed at 5,000. The country about it is exceptionally productive. Helena has good cotton trade, handles from 40 to 60,000 bales annually. She has a large lumber and grain commerce, has a foundry, oil mills, machine shops, and wagon factories. In brief, has $1 million invested in manufacturing industries. She has 2 railways, and is the commercial center of a broad and prosperous region. Her gross receipts of money, annually, from all sources, are placed by the New Orleans Times-Democrat at $4 million. Chapter 31. A Thumbprint and What Came of It. We were approaching Napoleon, Arkansas, so I began to think about my errand there. Time, noonday, and bright and sunny. This was bad. Not best, anyway, for mine was not preferably a noonday kind of errand. The more I thought, the more that fact pushed itself upon me, now in one form, now in another. Finally, it took the form of a distinct question. Is it good common sense to do the errand in daytime, when by a little sacrifice of comfort and inclination you can have night for it, and no inquisitive eyes around? This settled it. Plain question and plain answer make the shortest road out of most perplexities. I got my friends into my stateroom, and said I was sorry to create annoyance and disappointment, but that upon reflection it really seemed best that we put our luggage ashore and stop over at Napoleon. Their disapproval was prompt and loud, their language mutinous. Their main argument was one which has always been the first to come to the surface in such cases since the beginning of time. but you decided and agreed to stick to this boat, etc. As if, having determined to do an unwise thing, one is thereby bound to go ahead and make two unwise things of it, by carrying out that determination. I tried various mollifying tactics upon them, with reasonably good success, under which encouragement I increased my efforts, and to show them that I had not created this annoying errand, and was in no way to blame for it, I presently drifted into its history, substantially as follows. Toward the end of last year, I spent a few months in Munich, Bavaria. In November, I was living in Fräulein Dahlweiner's pension, 1A Karlstrasse. But my working quarters were a mile from there, in the house of a widow who supported herself by taking lodgers. She and her 2 young children used to drop in every morning and talk German to me, by request. One day, during a ramble about the city, I visited one of the 2 establishments where the government keeps and watches corpses until the doctors decide that they are permanently dead and not in a trance state. It was a grisly place, that spacious room. There were 36 corpses of adults in sight, stretched on their backs on slightly slanted boards in 3 long rows, all of them with wax-white, rigid faces, and all of them wrapped in white shrouds. Along the sides of the room there were deep alcoves, like bay windows, and in each of these lay several marble-visaged babes, utterly hidden and buried under banks of fresh flowers, all but their faces and crossed hands. Around a finger of each of these 50 still forms, both great and small, was a ring, and from the ring a wire led to the ceiling, and thence to a bell in a watch-room yonder, where, day and night, a watchman sits, always alert, and ready to spring to the aid of any of that pallid company who, waking out of death, shall make a movement. For any, even the slightest movement, will twitch the wire and ring that fearful bell. I imagined myself a death sentinel, drowsing there alone, far in the dragging watches of some wailing, gusty night, and having in a twinkling all my body stricken to quivering jelly by the sudden clamor of that awful summons. So I inquired about this thing, asked what resulted usually, if the watchman died and the restored corpse came and did what it could to make his last moments easy. But I was rebuked for trying to feed an idle and frivolous curiosity in so solemn and so mournful a place, and went my way with a humbled crest. Next morning, I was telling the widow my adventure when she exclaimed, "Come with me. I have a lodger who shall tell you all you want to know. He's been a night watchman there." He was a living man, but he did not look it. He was abed and had his head propped high on pillows. His face was wasted and colorless. His deep-sunken eyes were shut. His hand, lying on his breast, was talon-like. It was so bony and long-fingered. The widow began her introduction of me. The man's eyes opened slowly and glittered wickedly out from the twilight of their caverns. He frowned a black frown. He lifted his lean hand and waved us peremptorily away. But the widow kept straight on till she had got out the fact that I was a stranger and an American. The man's face changed at once, brightened, became even eager, and the next moment he and I were alone together. I opened up in cast-iron German. He responded in quite flexible English. Thereafter we gave the German language a permanent rest. This consumptive and I became good friends. I visited him every day, and we talked about everything, at least about everything but wives and children. Let anybody's wife or anybody's child be mentioned, and 3 things always followed. The most gracious and loving and tender light glimmered in the man's eyes for a moment, faded out the next, and in its place came that deadly look which had flamed there the first time I ever saw his lids unclose. Thirdly, he ceased from speech there and then for that day, lay silently, abstracted and absorbed, apparently heard nothing that I said, took no notice of my good-byes, and plainly did not know by either sight or hearing when I left the room. When I had been this Karl Ritter's daily and sole intimate during 2 months, he one day said abruptly, "I will tell you my story. Then he went on as follows. I have never given up until now. But now I have given up. I am going to die. I made up my mind last night that it must be, and very soon, too. You say you are going to revisit your river by and by, when you find opportunity. Very well. That, together with a certain strange experience which fell to my lot last night, determines me to tell you my history. For you will see Napoleon, Arkansas, and for my sake you will stop there and do a certain thing for me, a thing which you will willingly undertake after you have heard my narrative. Let us shorten the story wherever we can, for it will need it, being long. You already know how I came to go to America, and how I came to settle in that lonely region in the South. But you do not know that I had a wife. My wife was young, beautiful, loving, and oh, so divinely good and blameless and gentle, and our little girl was her mother in miniature. It was the happiest of happy households. One night, it was toward the close of the war, I woke up out of a sodden lethargy and found myself bound and gagged, and the air tainted with chloroform. I saw two men in the room, and one was saying to the other in a hoarse whisper, "I told her I would if she made a noise, and as for the child—" The other man interrupted in a low, half-crying voice, "You said we'd only gag them and rob them, not hurt them, or I wouldn't have come." "Shut up your whining. Had to change the plan when they waked up. You done all you could to protect them. Now let that satisfy you. Come, help rummage." Both men were masked and wore coarse, ragged nigger clothes. They had a bull's-eye lantern, and by its light I noticed that the gentler robber had no thumb on his right hand. They rummaged around my poor cabin for a moment. The head bandit then said in his stage whisper, "It's a waste of time. He shall tell where it's hid. Undo his gag and revive him up." The other said, "All right, provided no clubbing." "No clubbing it is, then, provided he keeps still." They approached me. Just then there was a sound outside, a sound of voices and trampling hoofs. The robbers held their breath and listened. The sounds came slowly nearer and nearer. Then came a shout. "Hello, the house! Show a light, we want water!" "The captain's voice, by God!" said the stage-whispering ruffian. And both robbers fled by the way of the back door, shutting off their bull's-eye as they ran. The stranger shouted several times more, then rode by. There seemed to be a dozen of the horses, and I heard nothing more. I struggled, but could not free myself from my bonds. I tried to speak, but the gag was effective. I could not make a sound. I listened for my wife's voice and my child's, listened long and intently, but no sound came from the other end of the room where their bed was. The silence became more and more awful, more and more ominous every moment. Could you have endured an hour of it, do you think? Pity me, then, who had to endure 3 hours. It was 3 ages. Whenever the clock struck, it seemed as if years had gone by since I'd heard it last. All this time, I was struggling in my bonds, and at last, about dawn, I got myself free and rose up and stretched my stiff limbs. I was able to distinguish things pretty well. The floor was littered with things thrown there by the robbers during their search for my savings. The first object that caught my particular attention was a document of mine which I'd seen the rougher of the two ruffians glance at and then cast away. It had blood on it. I staggered to the other end of the room. Oh, poor, unoffending, helpless ones, there they lay. Their troubles ended. Mine begun. Did I appeal to the law? I? Does it quench the pauper's thirst if the king drink for him? Oh, no, no, no. I wanted no impertinent interference of the law. Laws and the gallows could not pay the debt that was owing to me. Let the laws leave the matter in my hands and have no fears. I would find the debtor and collect the debt. How accomplish this, do you say? How accomplish it and feel so sure about it when I had neither seen the robbers' faces nor heard their natural voices, nor had any idea who they might be? Nevertheless, I was sure, quite confident. I had a clue which you would not have valued, a clue which would not have greatly helped even a detective, since he would lack the secret of how to apply it. I shall come to that presently. You shall see. Let us go on now, taking things in their due order. There was one circumstance which gave me a slant in a definite direction to begin with. Those two robbers were manifestly soldiers in tramp disguise, and not new to military service, but old in it, regulars perhaps. They did not acquire their soldierly attitude, gestures, carriage in a day nor a month, nor yet in a year. So I thought, but said nothing. And one of them had said, "The captain's voice, by God," the one whose life I would have. 2 miles away, several regiments were in camp, and 2 companies of U.S. cavalry. When I learned that Captain Blakely of Company C had passed our way that night with an escort, I said nothing. But in that company I resolved to seek my man. In conversation, I studiously and persistently described the robbers as tramps, camp followers, and among this class the people made useless search, none suspecting the soldiers but me. Working patiently by night in my desolated home, I made a disguise for myself out of various odds and ends of clothing. In the nearest village I bought a pair of blue goggles. By and by, when the military camp broke up and Company C was ordered 100 miles north to Napoleon, I secreted my small hoard of money in my belt and took my departure in the night. When Company C arrived in Napoleon, I was already there. Yes, I was there, with a new trade, fortune-teller. Not to seem partial, I made friends and told fortunes among all the companies garrisoned there, but I gave Company C the great bulk of my attentions. I made myself limitlessly obliging to these particular men. They could ask me no favor, put on me no risk which I would decline. I became the willing butt of their jokes. This perfected my popularity. I became a favorite. I early found a private who lacked a thumb. What joy it was to me! And when I found that he alone, of all the company, had lost a thumb, my last misgiving vanished. I was sure I was on the right track. This man's name was Kruger, a German. There were 9 Germans in the company. I watched to see who might be his intimates, but he seemed to have no special intimates. But I was his intimate, and I took care to make the intimacy grow. Sometimes I so hungered for my revenge that I could hardly restrain myself from going on my knees and begging him to point out the man who had murdered my wife and child. But I managed to bridle my tongue. I bided my time and went on telling fortunes, as opportunity afforded. My apparatus was simple, a little red paint and a bit of white paper. I painted the ball of the client's thumb, took a print of it on the paper, studied it that night, and revealed his fortune to him next day. What was my idea in this nonsense? It was this. When I was a youth, I knew an old Frenchman who had been a prison-keeper for 30 years, and he told me that there was one thing about a person which never changed from the cradle to the grave, the lines in the ball of the thumb. And he said that these lines were never exactly alike in the thumbs of any 2 human beings. In these days we photograph the new criminal and hang his picture in the rogues gallery for future reference. But that Frenchman, in his day, used to take a print of the ball of the new prisoner's thumb and put that away for future reference. He always said that pictures were no good. Future disguises could make them useless. "The thumb's the only sure thing," said he. "You can't disguise that." And he used to prove his theory, too, on my friends and acquaintances. It always succeeded. I went on telling fortunes. Every night I shut myself in, all alone, and studied the day's thumbprints with a magnifying glass. Imagine the devouring eagerness with which I pored over those mazy red spirals, with that document by my side which bore the right-hand thumb and finger marks of that unknown murderer, printed with the dearest blood to me that ever was shed on this earth. And many a time I had to repeat the same old disappointed remark. Will they never correspond? But my reward came at last. It was the print of the thumb of the 43rd man of Company C whom I had experimented on, Private Franz Adler. An hour before I did not know the murderer's name, or voice, or figure, or face, or nationality, But now I knew all those things. I believed I might feel sure, the Frenchman's repeated demonstrations being so good a warranty. Still, there was a way to make sure. I had an impression of Kruger's left thumb. In the morning, I took him aside when he was off duty, and when we were out of sight and hearing of witnesses, I said impressively, "A part of your fortune is so grave that I thought it would be better for you if I did not tell it in public. You and another man, whose fortune I was studying last night, Private Adler, have been murdering a woman and a child. You are being dogged. Within 5 days, both of you will be assassinated." He dropped on his knees, frightened out of his wits, and for 5 minutes kept pouring out the same set of words, like a demented person, and in the same half-crying way which was one of my memories of that murderous night in my cabin. "I didn't do it. Upon my soul, I didn't do it, and I tried to keep him from doing it. I did, as God is my witness. He did it alone." This was all I wanted, and I tried to get rid of the fool. But no, he clung to me, imploring me to save him from the assassin. He said, "I have money, $10,000 hid away, the fruit of loot and thievery. Save me, tell me what to do, and you shall have it, every penny. 2/3 of it is my cousin Adler's, but you can take it all. We hid it when we first came here, but I hid it in a new place yesterday, and have not told him, shall not tell him. I was going to desert and get away with it all. It is gold, and too heavy to carry when one is running and dodging. But a woman, who has been gone over the river 2 days, to prepare my way for me, is going to follow me with it, and if I got no chance to describe the hiding place to her, I was going to slip my silver watch into her hand, or send it to her, and she would understand. There's a piece of paper in the back of the case which tells it all. Here, take the watch. Tell me what to do." He was trying to press his watch upon me, and was exposing the paper and explaining it to me when Adler appeared on the scene, about a dozen yards away. I said to poor Kruger, "Put up your watch. I don't want it. You shan't come to any harm. Go now. I must tell Adler his fortune. Presently I will tell you how to escape the assassin. Meantime, I shall have to examine your thumb mark again. Say nothing to Adler about this thing. Say nothing to anybody." He went away filled with fright and gratitude, poor devil. I told Adler a long fortune, purposely so long that I could not finish it. Promised to come to him on guard that night, and tell him the really important part of it, the tragical part of it, I said, so must be out of reach of eavesdroppers. They always kept a picket watch outside the town, mere discipline and ceremony, no occasion for it, no enemy around. Toward midnight, I set out, equipped with a countersign, and picked my way toward the lonely region where Adler was to keep his watch. It was so dark that I stumbled right on a dim figure almost before I could get out a protecting word. The sentinel hailed, and I answered, both at the same moment. I added, "It's only me, the fortune-teller." Then I slipped to the poor devil's side, and without a word I drove my dirk into his heart. "Jawohl," laughed I. "It was the tragedy part of his fortune indeed." As he fell from his horse, he clutched at me, and my blue goggles remained in his hand, and away plunged the beast, dragging him with his foot in the stirrup. I fled through the woods and made good my escape, leaving the accusing goggles behind me in the dead man's hand. This was 15 or 16 years ago. Since then, I have wandered aimlessly about the earth, sometimes at work, sometimes idle, sometimes with money, sometimes with none, but always tired of life and wishing it was done, for my mission here was finished with the act of that night, and the only pleasure, solace, satisfaction I had in all those tedious years was in the daily reflection, I have killed him. 4 years ago my health began to fail. I had wandered into Munich in my purposeless way. Being out of money, I sought work and got it, did my duty faithfully about a year, and was then given the berth of night watchman yonder in that dead house which you visited lately. The place suited my mood. I liked it. I liked being with the dead, liked being alone with them. I used to wander among those rigid corpses and peer into their austere faces by the hour. The later the time, the more impressive it was. I preferred the late time. Sometimes I turned the lights low. This gave perspective, you see, and the imagination could play. Always the dim, receding ranks of the dead inspired me with weird and fascinating fancies. 2 years ago, I had been there a year then, I was sitting all alone in the watchroom one gusty winter's night, chilled, numb, comfortless, drowsing gradually into unconsciousness. The sobbing of the wind and the slamming of distant shutters falling fainter and fainter upon my dulling ear each moment, when sharp and suddenly that death bell rang out a blood-curdling alarm over my head. The shock of it nearly paralyzed me, for it was the first time I'd ever heard it. I gathered myself together and flew to the corpse room. About midway down the outside rank, a shrouded figure was sitting upright, wagging its head slowly from one side to the other, a grisly spectacle. Its side was turned toward me. I hurried to it and peered into its face. Heavens! It was Adler! Can you divine what my first thought was? Put into words, it was this: "It seems, then, you escaped me once. There will be a different result this time." Evidently, this creature was suffering unimaginable terrors. Think what it must have been to wake up in the midst of that voiceless hush, to look out over that grim congregation of the dead. What gratitude shone in his skinny white face when he saw a living form before him, and how the fervency of this mute gratitude was augmented when his eyes fell upon the life-giving cordials which I carried in my hands. Then imagine the horror which came into his pinched face when I put the cordials behind me and said mockingly, "Speak up, Franz Adler. Call upon these dead. Doubtless they will listen and have pity, but here there is none else that will." He tried to speak, but that part of the shroud which bound his jaws held firm and would not let him. He tried to lift imploring hands, but they were crossed upon his breast and tied. I said, "Shout, Franz Adler. Make the sleepers in the distant streets hear you and bring help. Shout and lose no time, for there's little to lose." "What, you cannot? That is a pity. But it is no matter. It does not always bring help. When you and your cousin murdered a helpless woman and child in a cabin in Arkansas, my wife it was, and my child, they shrieked for help, you remember? But it did no good. You remember that it did no good, is that not so? Your teeth chatter. Then why cannot you shout? Loosen the bandages with your hands. Then you can. Ah, I see. Your hands are tied. They cannot aid you. How strangely things repeat themselves after long years. For my hands were tied that night, you remember? Yes, tied much as yours are now. How odd that is. I could not pull free. It did not occur to you to untie me. It does not occur to me to untie you. Shh! There's a late footstep. It is coming this way. Ah, hark how here it is. One can count the footfalls. 1, 2, 3. There it is, just outside. Now is the time. Shout, man, shout. It's the one sole chance between you and eternity. Ah, you see, you have delayed too long. It has gone by. There, it's dying out. It's gone. Think of it. Reflect upon it. You have heard a human footstep for the last time. How curious it must be to listen to so common a sound as that, and know that one will never hear the fellow to it again. Oh, my friend, the agony in that shrouded face was ecstasy to see. I thought of a new torture and applied it, assisting myself with a trifle of lying invention. That poor Kruger tried to save my wife and child, and I did him a grateful good turn for it when the time came. I persuaded him to rob you, and I and a woman helped him to desert and got him away in safety. A look as of surprise and triumph shone out dimly through the anguish in my victim's face. I was disturbed, disquieted. I said, "What, then, didn't he escape?" A negative shake of the head. "No? What happened then?" The satisfaction in the shrouded face was still plainer. The man tried to mumble out some words, could not succeed, tried to express something with his obstructed hands, failed, paused a moment, then feebly tilted his head in a meaning way toward the corpse that lay nearest him. "Dead?" I asked. "Failed to escape? Caught in the act and shot?" Negative shake of the head. "Well, how then?" Again the man tried to do something with his hands. I watched closely, but could not guess the intent. I bent over and watched still more intently. He'd twisted a thumb around and was weakly punching at his breast with it. Ah, stab, do you mean? Affirmative nod, accompanied by a spectral smile of such devilishness that it struck an awakening light through my dull brain, and I cried, "Did I stab him, mistaking him for you? For that stroke was meant for none but you." The affirmative nod of the re-dying rascal was as joyous as his failing strength was able to put into its expression. Oh, miserable, miserable me, to slaughter the pitying soul that stood a friend to my darlings when they were helpless, and would have saved them if he could. Miserable, oh, miserable me. I fancied I heard the muffled gurgle of a mocking laugh. I took my face out of my hands and saw my enemy sinking back upon his inclined board. He was a satisfactory long time in dying. He had a wonderful vitality, an astonishing constitution. Yes, he was a pleasant long time at it. I got a chair and a newspaper and sat down by him and read. Occasionally I took a sip of brandy. This was necessary on account of the cold. But I did it partly because I saw that, along at first, whenever I reached for the bottle, he thought I was going to give him some. I read aloud, mainly imaginary accounts of people snatched from the grave's threshold and restored to life and vigor by a few spoonfuls of liquor and a warm bath. Yes, he had a long, hard death of it. 3 hours and 6 minutes from the time he rang his bell. It is believed that in all these 18 years that have elapsed since the institution of the corpse watch, no shrouded occupant of the Bavarian dead houses has ever rung its bell. Well, it is a harmless belief. Let it stand at that. The chill of that death room had penetrated my bones. It revived and fastened upon me the disease which had been afflicting me, but which up to that night had been steadily disappearing. That man murdered my wife and child, and in 3 days hence he will have added me to his list. No matter. God, how delicious the memory of it! I caught him escaping from his grave and thrust him back into it. After that night, I was confined to my bed for a week. But as soon as I could get about, I went to the dead house books and got the number of the house which Adler had died in. A wretched lodging-house it was. It was my idea that he would naturally have gotten hold of Kruger's effects, being his cousin, and I wanted to get Kruger's watch if I could. But while I was sick, Adler's things had been sold and scattered, all except a few old letters and some odds and ends of no value. However, through those letters I traced out a son of Kruger's, the only relative he left. He is a man of 30 now, a shoemaker by trade, and living at number 14 Königstrasse, Mannheim. Widower, with several small children. Without explaining to him why, I have furnished 2/3 of his support ever since. Now as to that watch, see how strangely things happen. I traced it around and about Germany for more than a year, at considerable cost in money and vexation, and at last I got it. Got it, and was unspeakably glad. Opened it and found nothing in it. Why, I might have known that that bit of paper was not going to stay there all this time. Of course, I gave up that $10,000 then, gave it up and dropped it out of my mind, and most sorrowfully, for I'd wanted it for Kruger's son. Last night, when I consented at last that I must die, I began to make ready. I proceeded to burn all useless papers, and sure enough, from a batch of Adlers, not previously examined with thoroughness, out dropped that long-desired scrap. I recognized it in a moment. Here it is. I will translate it. Brick livery stable, stone foundation, middle of town, corner of Orleans and Market. Corner toward courthouse. 3rd stone, 4th row. Stick notice there, saying how many are to come. There, take it and preserve it. Kruger explained that that stone was removable, and that it was in the north wall of the foundation, 4th row from the top and 3rd stone from the west. The money is secreted behind it. He said the closing sentence was a blind, to mislead in case the paper should fall into wrong hands. It probably performed that office for Adler. Now I want to beg that when you make your intended journey down the river, you will hunt out that hidden money and send it to Adam Kruger, care of the Mannheim address, which I have mentioned. It will make a rich man of him, and I shall sleep the sounder in my grave for knowing that I have done what I could for the son of the man who tried to save my wife and child, albeit my hand ignorantly struck him down, whereas the impulse of my heart would have been to shield and serve him. Chapter 32. The Disposal of a Bonanza. Such was Ritter's narrative, said I to my two friends. There was a profound and impressive silence, which lasted a considerable time. Then both men broke into a fusillade of excited and admiring ejaculations over the strange incidents of the tale, and this, along with a rattling fire of questions, was kept up until all hands were about out of breath. Then my friends began to cool down and draw off, under shelter of occasional volleys, into silence and abysmal reverie. For 10 minutes now there was stillness. Then Rogers said dreamily, $10,000, adding after a considerable pause, 10,000, that's a heap of money. Presently the poet inquired, Are you going to send it to him right away? Yes, I said. It is a queer question. No reply. After a little, Rogers asked hesitatingly, All of it? That is, certainly, all of it. I was going to say more, but was stopped by a train of thought which started up in me. Thompson spoke, but my mind was absent, and I did not catch what he said, but I heard Rogers answer, Yet it seems so to me. It ought to be quite sufficient, for I don't see that he has done anything. Presently the poet said, When you come to look at it, it is more than sufficient. Just look at it. $5,000. Why, he couldn't spend it in a lifetime. It would injure him, too, perhaps ruin him. You want to look at that. In a little while he'd throw his last away, shut up his shop, maybe take to drinking, maltreat his motherless children, drift into other evil courses, go steadily from bad to worse. Yes, that's it, interrupted Rogers fervently. I've seen it 100 times. Yes, more than 100. You put money into the hands of a man like that if you want to destroy him, that's all. Just put money into his hands is all you've got to do, and if it don't pull him down and take all the usefulness out of him, and all the self-respect and everything, then I don't know human nature. Ain't that so, Thompson? And even if we were to give him that third of it, why, in less than 6 months— Less than 6 weeks, you'd better say, said I, warming up and breaking in. Unless he had that $3,000 in safe hands where he couldn't touch it, he would no more last you 6 weeks than— Of course he wouldn't, said Thompson. I've edited books for that kind of people, and the moment they get their hands on the royalty, maybe it's 3,000, maybe it's 2,000. What business has that shoemaker with $2,000, I should like to know, broke in Rogers earnestly. A man perhaps perfectly contented now there in Mannheim, surrounded by his own class, eating his bread with the appetite which laborious industry alone can give, enjoying his humble life, honest, upright, pure in heart, and blessed, yes, I say blessed, above all the myriads that go in silk attire and walk the empty artificial round of social folly. But just you put that temptation before him once. Just you lay $1,500 before a man like that and say, $1,500, cried I. 500 would rot his principles, paralyze his industry, drag him to the rum shop, thence to the gutter, thence to the almshouse, thence to— Why put upon ourselves this crime, gentlemen, interrupted the poet earnestly and appealingly. He is happy where he is, and as he is. Every sentiment of honor, every sentiment of charity, every sentiment of high and sacred benevolence warns us, beseeches us, commands us to leave him undisturbed. That is real friendship. That is true friendship. We could follow other courses that would be more showy, but none that would be so truly kind and wise, depend upon it. After some further talk, it became evident that each of us, down in his heart, felt some misgivings over this settlement of the matter. It was manifest that we all felt that we ought to send the poor shoemaker something. There was long and thoughtful discussion of this point, and we finally decided to send him a chromo. Well, now that everything seemed to be arranged satisfactorily to everybody concerned, a new trouble broke out. It transpired that these two men were expecting to share equally in the money with me. That was not my idea. I said that if they got half of it between them, they might consider themselves lucky. Rogers said, "Who would have had any if it hadn't been for me?" I flung out the first hint. But for that, it would have all gone to the shoemaker. Thompson said he was thinking of the thing himself at the very moment that Rogers had originally spoken. I retorted that the idea would have occurred to me plenty soon enough, and without anybody's help. I was slow about thinking, maybe, but I was sure. This matter warmed up into a quarrel, then into a fight, and each man got pretty badly battered. As soon as I got myself mended up after a fashion, I ascended to the hurricane deck in a pretty sour humor. I found Captain McCord there, and said, as pleasantly as my humor would permit, "I have come to say goodbye, Captain. I wish to go ashore at Napoleon." "Go ashore where?" "Napoleon." The captain laughed, but seeing that I was not in a jovial mood, stopped that and said, "But are you serious?" "Serious? I certainly am." The captain glanced up at the pilot-house and said, "He wants to get off at Napoleon." "Napoleon?" "That's what he says." "Great Caesar's ghost!" Uncle Mumford approached along the deck. The captain said, "Uncle, here's a friend of yours wants to get off at Napoleon." "Well, boy," I said, "come, what is all this about? Can't a man go ashore at Napoleon if he wants to?" "Why, hang it, didn't you know? There isn't any Napoleon anymore. Hasn't been for years and years. The Arkansas River burst through it, tore it all to rags, and emptied it into the Mississippi. Carried the whole town away. Banks, churches, jails, newspaper offices, courthouse, theater, fire department, livery stable. Everything? Everything. Just a 15-minute job, or such a matter. Didn't leave a hide nor hair, shred nor shingle of it, except the fag end of a shanty and one brick chimney. This boat is paddling along right now where the dead center of that town used to be. Yonder's the brick chimney, all that's left of Napoleon. These dense woods on the right used to be a mile back of the town. Take a look behind you, upstream. Now you begin to recognize this country, don't you?" "Yes, I do recognize it now. It's the most wonderful thing I ever heard of. By a long shot, the most wonderful and unexpected." Mr. Thompson and Mr. Rogers had arrived, meantime, with satchels and umbrellas, and had silently listened to the captain's news. Thompson put $50 in my hand and said softly, "For my share of the chromo." Rogers followed suit. Yes, it was an astonishing thing to see the Mississippi rolling between unpeopled shores and straight over the spot where I used to see a good, big, self-complacent town 20 years ago. Town that was the county seat of a great and important county. Town with a big United States Marine hospital. Town of innumerable fights, an inquest every day. Town where I had used to know the prettiest girl and the most accomplished in the whole Mississippi Valley. Town where we were handed the first printed news of the Pennsylvania's mournful disaster a quarter of a century ago. A town no more, swallowed up, vanished, gone to feed the fishes. Nothing left but a fragment of a shanty and a crumbling brick chimney.
This ends Disc 7, Life on the Mississippi, Disc 8.
Chapter 33. Refreshments and Ethics. In regard to Island 74, which is situated not far from the former Napoleon, a freak of the river here has sorely perplexed the laws of men and made them a vanity and a jest. When the state of Arkansas was chartered, she controlled to the center of the river, a most unstable line. The state of Mississippi claimed to the channel, another shifty and unstable line. Number 74 belonged to Arkansas. By and by, a cutoff threw this big island out of Arkansas, and yet not within Mississippi. Middle of the river on one side of it, channel on the other. That is as I understand the problem. Whether I have got the details right or wrong, this fact remains, that here is this big and exceedingly valuable island of 4,000 acres, thrust out in the cold, and belonging to neither the one state nor the other, paying taxes to neither, owing allegiance to neither. One man owns the whole island, and of right is the man without a country. Island 92 belongs to Arkansas. The river moved it over and joined it to Mississippi. A chap established a whiskey shop there without a Mississippi license, and enriched himself upon Mississippi custom under Arkansas protection, where no license was in those days required. We glided steadily down the river in the usual privacy, steamboat or other moving thing seldom seen. Scenery as always, stretch upon stretch of almost unbroken forest on both sides of the river. Soundless solitude. Here and there a cabin or two, standing in small openings on the gray and grassless banks. Cabins which had formerly stood a quarter or half-mile farther to the front, and gradually been pulled farther and farther back as the shores caved in. As at Pilcher's Point, for instance, where the cabins had been moved back 300 yards in 3 months, so we were told. But the caving banks had already caught up with them, and they were being conveyed rearward once more. Napoleon had but small opinion of Greenville, Mississippi, in the old times. But behold, Napoleon is gone to the catfishes, and here is Greenville, full of life and activity, and making a considerable flourish in the valley, having 3,000 inhabitants, it is said, and doing a gross trade of $2,500,000 annually. A growing town. There was much talk on the boat about the Calhoun Land Company, an enterprise which is expected to work wholesome results. Colonel Calhoun, a grandson of the statesman, went to Boston and formed a syndicate, which purchased a large tract of land on the river in Chico County, Arkansas, some 10,000 acres, for cotton growing. The purpose is to work on a cash basis, buy at first hands, and handle their own product, supply their Negro laborers with provisions and necessities at a trifling profit, say 8 or 10%, furnish them comfortable quarters, etc., and encourage them to save money and remain on the place. If this proves a financial success, as seems quite certain, they propose to establish a banking house in Greenville and lend money at an unburdensome rate of interest. 6% is spoken of. The trouble heretofore has been, I am quoting remarks of planters and steamboatmen, that the planters, although owning the land, were without cash capital, had to hypothecate both land and crop to carry on the business. Consequently, the commission dealer who furnishes the money takes some risk and demands big interest, usually 10%, and 2.5% for negotiating the loan. The planter has also to buy his supplies through the same dealer, paying commissions and profits. Then, when he ships his crop, the dealer adds his commissions, insurance, etc. So taking it by and large, and first and last, the dealer's share of that crop is about 25%. A cotton planter's estimate of the average margin of profit on planting in this section. One man and mule will raise 10 acres of cotton, giving 10 bales cotton worth, say, $500. Cost of producing, say, $350. Net profit, $150, or $15 per acre. There is also a profit now from the cotton seed, which formerly had little value, none where much transportation was necessary. In 1,600 pounds crude cotton, 400 are lint, worth, say, 10 cents a pound, and 1,200 pounds of seed worth $12 or $13 per ton. Maybe in future even the stems will not be thrown away. Mr. Edward Atkinson says that for each bale of cotton there are 1,500 pounds of stems, and that these are very rich in phosphate of lime and potash. That when ground and mixed up with ensilage or cottonseed meal, which is too rich for use as fodder in large quantities, the stem mixture makes a superior food, rich in all the elements needed for the production of milk, meat, and bone. Heretofore, the stems have been considered a nuisance. Complaint is made that the planter remains grouty toward the former slave since the war, will have nothing but a chill business relation with him, no sentiment permitted to intrude, will not keep a store himself and supply the Negro's wants, and thus protect the Negro's pocket, and make him able and willing to stay on the place, and an advantage to him to do it, but lets that privilege to some thrifty Israelite who encourages the thoughtless Negro and wife to buy all sorts of things which they could do without, buy on credit at big prices month after month, credit based on the Negro's share of the growing crop. And at the end of the season, the Negro's share belongs to the Israelite. The Negro is in debt besides, is discouraged, dissatisfied, restless, and both he and the planter are injured, for he will take steamboat and migrate, and the planter must get a stranger in his place who does not know him, does not care for him, will fatten the Israelite a season and follow his predecessor per steamboat. It is hoped that the Calhoun Company will show by its humane and protective treatment of its laborers that its method is the most profitable for both planter and Negro, and it is believed that a general adoption of that method will then follow. And where so many are saying their say, shall not the barkeeper testify? He is thoughtful, observant, never drinks, endeavors to earn his salary, and would earn it if there were custom enough. He says the people along here in Mississippi and Louisiana will send up the river to buy vegetables rather than raise them, and they will come aboard at the landings and buy fruits of the barkeeper. Thinks they don't know anything but cotton, believes they don't know how to raise vegetables and fruit, at least the most of them. Says a nigger will go to H for a watermelon. H is all I find in the stenographer's report. Means Halifax, probably, though that seems a good way to go for a watermelon. Barkeeper buys watermelons for 5 cents up the river, brings them down, and sells them for 50. Why does he mix such elaborate and picturesque drinks for the nigger hands on the boat? Because they won't have any other. They want a big drink. Don't make any difference what you make it of. They want it worth their money. You give a nigger a plain gill of $half brandy for 5 cents, will he touch it? No. Ain't size enough to it. But you put up a pint of all kinds of worthless rubbish and heave in some red stuff to make it beautiful, red's the main thing, and he wouldn't put down that glass to go to a circus. All the bars on this anchor line are rented and owned by one firm. They furnish the liquors from their own establishment and hire the barkeepers on salary. Good liquors? Yes, on some of the boats, where there are the kind of passengers that want it and can pay for it. On the other boats, no. Nobody but the deckhands and firemen drink it. Brandy? Yes, I've got brandy, plenty of it. But you don't want any of it unless you've made your will. It isn't as it used to be in the old times. Then everybody traveled by steamboat, everybody drank, and everybody treated everybody else. Now most everybody goes by railroad, and the rest don't drink. In the old times, the barkeeper owned the bar himself, and was gay and smarty and talky and all jeweled up, and was the toniest aristocrat on the boat. He used to make $2,000 on a trip. A father who left his son a steamboat bar left him a fortune. Now he leaves him board and lodging. Yes, and washing if a shirt a trip will do. Yes, indeedy, times are changed. Why, do you know, on the principal line of boats on the upper Mississippi, they don't have any bar at all. Sounds like poetry, but it's the petrified truth. Chapter 34. Tough Yarns. Stack Island. I remembered Stack Island, also Lake Providence, Louisiana. which is the first distinctly southern-looking town you come to, downward bound, lies level and low, shade trees hung with venerable gray beards of Spanish moss, restful, pensive, Sunday aspect about the place, comments Uncle Mumford with feeling, also with truth. A Mr. H. furnished some minor details of fact concerning this region, which I would have hesitated to believe if I'd not known him to be a steamboat mate. He was a passenger of ours, a resident of Arkansas City, and bound to Vicksburg to join his boat, a little sunflower packet. He was an austere man, and had the reputation of being singularly unworldly for a riverman. Among other things, he said that Arkansas had been injured and kept back by generations of exaggerations concerning the mosquitoes there. One may smile, said he, and turn the matter off as being a small thing, but when you come to look at the effects produced, in the way of discouragement of immigration and diminished values of property, it was quite the opposite of a small thing, or a thing in any wise to be coughed down or sneered at. These mosquitoes had been persistently represented as being formidable and lawless, whereas the truth is they're feeble, insignificant in size, diffident to a fault, sensitive, and so on, and so on. You would have supposed he was talking about his family. But if he was soft on the Arkansas mosquitoes, he was hard enough on the mosquitoes of Lake Providence to make up for it. Those Lake Providence colossi, as he finally called them. He said that 2 of them could whip a dog, and that 4 of them could hold a man down, and except help come, they would kill him, butcher him, as he expressed it. Referred in a sort of casual way, and yet significant way, to the fact that the life policy in its simplest form is unknown in Lake Providence. They take out a mosquito policy besides. He told many remarkable things about those lawless insects. Among others, said he had seen them try to vote. Noticing that this statement seemed to be a good deal of a strain on us, he modified it a little, said he might have been mistaken as to that particular, but he knew he'd seen him around the polls canvassing. There was another passenger, a friend of H's, who backed up the harsh evidence against those mosquitoes and detailed some stirring adventures which he had with them. The stories were pretty sizable, merely pretty sizable. Yet Mr. H. was continually interrupting with a cold, inexorable, "Wait, knock off 25% of that. Now go on." Or, "Wait, you're getting too strong. Cut it down, cut it down. You get a little too much costumery into your statements. Always dress a fact in tights, never in an ulster." Or, "Pardon once more, if you're going to load anything more onto that statement, you want to get a couple of lighters and tow the rest, because it's drawn all the water there is in the river already. Stick to the facts. Just stick to the cold facts. What these gentlemen want for a book is the frozen truth. Ain't that so, gentlemen?" He explained privately that it was necessary to watch this man all the time and keep him within bounds. It would not do to neglect this precaution, as he, Mr. H., knew to his sorrow. Said he, "I'll not deceive you. He told me such a monstrous lie once that it swelled my left ear up and spread it so that I was actually not able to see out around it. It remained so for months, and people came miles to see me fan myself with it." Chapter 35. Vicksburg during the Trouble. We used to plow past the lofty hill city, Vicksburg, downstream, but we cannot do that now. A cutoff has made a country town of it, like Osceola, St. Genevieve, and several others. There is currentless water, also a big island in front of Vicksburg now. You come down the river the other side of the island, then turn and come up to the town, that is, in high water. In low water you can't come up, but must land some distance below it. Signs and scars still remain, as reminders of Vicksburg's tremendous war experiences. Earthworks, trees crippled by the cannonballs, cave refuges in the clay precipices, etc. The caves did good service during the 6 weeks' bombardment of the city, May 18th to July 4th, 1863. They were used by the non-combatants, mainly by the women and children, not to live in constantly, but to fly to for safety on occasion. They were mere holes, tunnels driven into the perpendicular clay bank, then branched Y-shape within the hill. Life in Vicksburg during the 6 weeks was perhaps... But wait. Here are some materials out of which to reproduce it. Population, 27,000 soldiers and 3,000 non-combatants. The city, utterly cut off from the world, walled solidly in. The frontage by gunboats, the rear by soldiers and batteries. Hence, no buying and selling with the outsider, no passing to or fro, no God-speeding a parting guest, no welcoming a coming one, no printed acres of worldwide news to be read at breakfast mornings. A tedious, dull absence of such matter instead. Hence, also, no running to see steamboats smoking into view in the distance, up or down, and ploughing toward the town. For none came. The river lay vacant and undisturbed. No rush and turmoil around the railway station. No struggling over the bewildered swarms of passengers by noisy mobs of hackmen. All quiet there. Flour, $200 a barrel. Sugar, $30. Corn, $10 a bushel. Bacon, $5 a pound. Rum, $100 a gallon. Other things in proportion. Consequently, no roar and racket of drays and carriages tearing along the streets. Nothing for them to do among that handful of non-combatants, of exhausted means. At 3 o'clock in the morning, silence. Silence so dead that the measured tramp of a sentinel can be heard a seemingly impossible distance. Out of hearing of this lonely sound, perhaps the stillness is absolute. All in a moment come ground-shaking thunder crashes of artillery. The sky is cobwebbed with the criss-crossing red lines streaming from soaring bombshells, and a rain of iron fragments descends upon the city, descends upon the empty streets, streets which are not empty a moment later, but mottled with dim figures of frantic women and children scurrying from home and bed toward the cave dungeons, encouraged by the humorous grim soldiery, who shout, "Rats to your holes," and laugh. The cannon thunder rages, shells scream and crash overhead. The iron rain pours down 1 hour, 2 hours, 3, possibly 6, then stops. Silence follows, but the streets are still empty. The silence continues. By and by a head projects from a cave here and there and yonder, and reconnoiters cautiously. The silence still continuing. Bodies follow heads, and jaded, half-smothered creatures group themselves about, stretch their cramped limbs, draw in deep draughts of the grateful fresh air, gossip with the neighbors from the next cave, maybe straggle off home presently, or take a lounge through the town if the stillness continues, and will scurry to the holes again by and by when the war tempest breaks forth once more. There being but 3,000 of these cave-dwellers, merely the population of a village, would they not come to know each other after a week or two, and familiarly, insomuch that the fortunate or unfortunate experiences of one would be of interest to all? Those are the materials furnished by history. From them might not almost anybody reproduce for himself the life of that time in Vicksburg? Could you, who did not experience it, come nearer to reproducing it to the imagination of another non-participant than could a Vicksburger who did experience it? It seems impossible. And yet there are reasons why it might not really be. When one makes his first voyage in a ship, it is an experience which multitudinously bristles with striking novelties, novelties which are in such sharp contrast with all this person's former experiences that they take a seemingly deathless grip upon his imagination and memory. By tongue or pen, he can make a landsman live that strange and stirring voyage over with him, make him see it all and feel it all. But if he wait, if he make 10 voyages in succession, what then? Why, the thing has lost color, snap, surprise, and has become commonplace. The man would have nothing to tell that would quicken a landsman's pulse. Years ago, I talked with a couple of the Vicksburg non-combatants, a man and his wife. Left to tell their story in their own way, these people told it without fire, almost without interest. A week of their wonderful life there would have made their tongues eloquent forever, perhaps. But they had 6 weeks of it, and that wore the novelty all out. They got used to being bomb-shelled out of home and into the ground. The matter became commonplace. After that, the possibility of their ever being startlingly interesting in their talks about it was gone. What the man said was to this effect. It got to be Sunday all the time. 7 Sundays a week, to us anyway. We hadn't anything to do, and time hung heavy. 7 Sundays, and all of them broken up at one time or another, in the day or in the night, by a few hours of the awful storm of fire and thunder and iron. At first we used to shin for the holes a good deal faster than we did afterward. The first time I forgot the children, and Maria fetched them both along. When she was all safe in the cave, she fainted. 2 or 3 weeks afterward, when she was running for the holes, one morning, through a shell shower, a big shell burst near her and covered her all over with dirt, and a piece of iron carried away her game bag of false hair from the back of her head. Well, she stopped to get that game bag before she shoved along again. Was getting used to things already, you see. We all got so we could tell a good deal about shells, and after that we didn't always go under shelter if it was a light shower. Us men would loaf around and talk, and a man would say, "There she goes," and name the kind of shell it was from the sound of it, and go on talking, if there wasn't any danger from it. If a shell was bursting close over us, we stopped talking and stood still. Uncomfortable, yes, but it wasn't safe to move. When it let go, we went on talking again, if nobody was hurt, maybe saying, "That was a ripper," or some such commonplace comment before we resumed. Or maybe we would see a shell poising itself away high in the air overhead. In that case, every fellow just whipped out a sudden "See you again, gents," and shoved. Often and often I saw gangs of ladies promenading the streets, looking as cheerful as you please and keeping an eye canted up watching the shells. And I've seen them stop still when they were uncertain about what a shell was going to do, and wait and make certain. And after that, they sauntered along again, or lit out for shelter according to the verdict. Streets in some towns have a litter of pieces of paper and odds and ends of one sort or another lying around. Ours hadn't. They had iron litter. Sometimes a man would gather up all the iron fragments and unbursted shells in his neighborhood and pile them into a kind of monument in his front yard. A ton of it sometimes. No glass left. Glass couldn't stand such a bombardment. It was all shivered out. Windows of the houses vacant, looked like eye holes in a skull. Whole panes were as scarce as news. We had church Sundays, not many there, along at first, but by and by pretty good turnouts. I've seen service stop a minute, and everybody sit quiet, no voice heard, pretty funeral-like then, and all the more so on account of the awful boom and crash going on outside and overhead. And pretty soon, when a body could be heard, service would go on again. Organs and church music mixed up with a bombardment is a powerful, queer combination. Along at first. Coming out of church one morning, we had an accident. The only one that happened around me on a Sunday. I was just having a hearty handshake with a friend I hadn't seen for a while and saying, "Drop into our cave tonight after the bombardment. We got a pint of prime whiskey," is what I was going to say, but a shell interrupted. A chunk of it cut the man's arm off and left it dangling in my hand. And the thing that is going to stick the longest in my memory and outlast everything else, little and big, I reckon, is the mean thought I had then. It was, the whiskey is saved. And yet, don't you know, it was kind of excusable because it was as scarce as diamonds, and we had only just that little. Never had another taste during the siege. Sometimes the caves were desperately crowded, and all was hot and close. Sometimes the cave had 20 or 25 people packed into it. No turning room for anybody. Air so foul sometimes you couldn't have made a candle burn in it. A child was born in one of those caves one night. Think of that. Why, it was like having it born in a trunk. Twice we had 16 people in our cave, and a number of times we had a dozen. Pretty suffocating in there. We always had 8. 8 belonged there. Hungry and misery and sickness and fright and sorrow, and I don't know what all, got so loaded into them that none of them were ever rightly their old selves after the siege. They all died but 3 of us within a couple of years. One night a shell burst in front of the hole and caved it in and stopped it up. It was lively times for a while digging out. Some of us came near to smothering. After that we made 2 openings. Ought to have thought of that at first. Mule meat? No, we only got down to that the last day or 2. Of course it was good. Anything's good when you're starving. This man had kept a diary. 6 weeks? No, only the first 6 days. The first day, 8 close pages. The second, 5. The third, 1, loosely written. The fourth, 3 or 4 lines. A line or 2 the 5th and 6th days. The 7th day, diary abandoned. Life in terrific Vicksburg having now become commonplace and matter of course. The war history of Vicksburg has more about it to interest the general reader than that of any other of the river towns. It is full of variety, full of incident, full of the picturesque. Vicksburg held out longer than any other important river town, and saw warfare in all its phases, both land and water. The siege, the mine, the assault, the repulse, the bombardment, sickness, captivity, famine. The most beautiful of all the national cemeteries is here. Over the great gateway is this inscription: Here rest in peace 16,600 who died for their country in the years 1861 to 1865. The grounds are nobly situated, being very high and commanding a wide prospect of land and river. They are tastefully laid out in broad terraces, with winding roads and paths, and there is profuse adornment in the way of semi-tropical shrubs and flowers, and in one part is a piece of native wildwood, left just as it grew, and therefore perfect in its charm. Everything about this cemetery suggests the hand of the national government. The government's work is always conspicuous for excellence, solidity, thoroughness, neatness. The government does its work well in the first place, and then takes care of it. By winding roads, which were often cut to so great a depth between perpendicular walls that they were mere roofless tunnels, we drove out a mile or 2 and visited the monument which stands upon the scene of the surrender of Vicksburg to General Grant by General Pemberton. Its metal will preserve it from the hackings and chippings which so defaced its predecessor, which was of marble. But the brick foundations are crumbling, and it'll tumble down by and by. It overlooks a picturesque region of wooded hills and ravines, and is not unpicturesque itself, being well smothered in flowering weeds. The battered remnant of the marble monument has been removed to the National Cemetery. On the road, a quarter of a mile townward, an aged colored man showed us, with pride, an unexploded bombshell which had lain in his yard since the day it fell there during the siege. "I was a-standing here, and the dog was a-standing here. The dog, he went for the shell, going to pick a fuss with it. But I didn't. I says, just make yourself at home here, lay still where you is, or bust up the place just as you's a mind to, but I's got business out in the woods, I has." Vicksburg is a town of substantial business streets and pleasant residences. It commands the commerce of the Yazoo and Sunflower rivers, is pushing railways in several directions through rich agricultural regions, and has a promising future of prosperity and importance. Apparently, nearly all the river towns, big and little, have made up their minds they must look mainly to the railroads for wealth and upbuilding henceforth. They are acting upon this idea. The signs are that the next 20 years will bring about some noteworthy changes in the valley, in the direction of increased population and wealth, and in the intellectual advancement and the liberalizing of opinion which go naturally with these. And yet, if one may judge by the past, The river towns will manage to find and use a chance here and there to cripple and retard their progress. They kept themselves back in the days of steamboating supremacy by a system of wharfage dues so stupidly graded as to prohibit what may be called small retail traffic in freights and passengers. Boats were charged such heavy wharfage that they could not afford to land for 1 or 2 passengers or a light lot of freight. Instead of encouraging the bringing of trade to their doors, the towns diligently and effectively discouraged it. They could have had many boats and low rates, but their policy rendered few boats and high rates compulsory. It was a policy which extended and extends from New Orleans to St. Paul. We had a strong desire to make a trip up the Yazoo and the Sunflower, an interesting region at any time, but additionally interesting at this time because up there the great inundation was still to be seen in force. But we were nearly sure to have to wait a day or more for a New Orleans boat on return, so we were obliged to give up the project. Here's a story which I picked up on board the boat that night. I insert it in this place merely because it is a good story, not because it belongs here, for it doesn't. It was told by a passenger, a college professor, and was called to the surface in the course of a general conversation which began with talk about horses, drifted into talk about astronomy, then into talk about the lynching of the gamblers in Vicksburg half a century ago, and then into talk about dreams and superstitions, and ended, after midnight, in a dispute over free trade and protection. Chapter 36. The Professor's Yarn. It was in the early days. I was not a college professor then. I was a humble-minded young land surveyor with the world before me, to survey in case anybody wanted it done. I had a contract to survey a route for a great mining ditch in California, and I was on my way thither by sea, a 3 or 4 weeks' voyage. There were a good many passengers, but I had very little to say to them. Reading and dreaming were my passions, and I avoided conversation in order to indulge these appetites. There were 3 professional gamblers on board, rough, repulsive fellows. I never had any talk with them, yet I could not help seeing them with some frequency, for they gambled in an upper-deck stateroom every day and night, and in my promenades I often had glimpses of them through their door, which stood a little ajar to let out the surplus tobacco smoke and profanity. They were an evil and hateful presence, but I had to put up with it, of course. There was one other passenger who fell under my eye a good deal, for he seemed determined to be friendly with me, and I could not have gotten rid of him without running some chance of hurting his feelings, and I was far from wishing to do that. Besides, there was something engaging in his countrified simplicity and his beaming good nature. The first time I saw this Mr. John Backus, I guessed, from his clothes and his looks, that he was a grazier or farmer from the backwoods of some western state, doubtless Ohio. And afterward, when he dropped into his personal history and I discovered that he was a cattle-raiser from interior Ohio, I was so pleased with my own penetration that I warmed toward him for verifying my instinct. He got to dropping alongside me every day after breakfast to help me make my promenade. And so, in the course of time, his easy working jaw had told me everything about his business, his prospects, his family, his relatives, his politics, in fact, everything that concerned a Bacchus, living or dead. And meantime, I think he had managed to get out of me everything I knew about my trade, my tribe, my purposes, my prospects, and myself. He was a gentle and persuasive genius, and this thing showed it. For I was not given to talking about my matters. I said something about triangulation once. The stately word pleased his ear. He inquired what it meant. I explained. After that, he quietly and inoffensively ignored my name, and always called me Triangle. What an enthusiast he was in cattle! At the bare name of a bull or a cow, his eye would light, and his eloquent tongue would turn itself loose. As long as I would walk and listen, he would walk and talk. He knew all the breeds. He loved all breeds. He caressed them all with his affectionate tongue. I tramped along in voiceless misery while the cattle question was up. When I could endure it no longer, I used to deftly insert a scientific topic into the conversation. Then my eye fired and his faded. My tongue fluttered, his stopped. Life was a joy to me and a sadness to him. One day he said, a little hesitatingly and with somewhat of diffidence, "Triangle, would you mind coming down to my stateroom a minute and have a little talk on a certain matter?" I went with him at once. Arrived there, he put his head out, glanced up and down the saloon warily, then closed the door and locked it. We sat down on the sofa, and he said, "I'm going to make a little proposition to you, and if it strikes you favorable, it'll be a middling good thing for both of us. You ain't a-going out to California for fun, neither am I. It's business, ain't that so? Well, you can do me a good turn, and so I can do you, if we see fit. I've raked and scraped and saved a considerable many years, and I've got it all here." He unlocked an old hair trunk, tumbled a chaos of shabby clothes aside, and drew a short, stout bag into view for a moment, then buried it again and relocked the trunk. Dropping his voice to a cautious, low tone, he continued, "She's all there, around $10,000 in yellow boys. Now this is my idea. What I don't know about raising cattle ain't worth knowing. There's mints of money in it in California. Well, I know and you know that along a line that's being surveyed there's little dabs of land they call gores that fall to the surveyor free, gratis, for nothing. All you got to do on your side is to survey 'em in such a way that the gores will fall on good fat land. Then you turn 'em over to me. I stock 'em with cattle, in rolls of cash. I plunk out your share of the dollars reg'lar right along, and—" I was sorry to wither his blooming enthusiasm, but it could not be helped. I interrupted and said severely, "I am not that kind of a surveyor. Let us change the subject, Mr. Backus." It was pitiful to see his confusion and hear his awkward and shame-faced apologies. I was as much distressed as he was, especially as he seemed so far from having suspected that there was anything improper in his proposition. So I hastened to console him and lead him on to forget his mishap in a conversational orgy about cattle and butchery. We were lying at Acapulco, and as we went on deck it happened luckily that the crew were just beginning to hoist some beeves aboard in slings. Backus's melancholy vanished instantly, and with it the memory of his late mistake. "Now only look at that," cried he. "My goodness, Triangle, what would they say to it in Ohio? Wouldn't their eyes bug out to see him handled like that? Wouldn't they, though?" All the passengers were on deck to look, even the gamblers, and Backus knew them all, and had afflicted them all with his pet topic. As I moved away, I saw one of the gamblers approach and accost him, then another of them, then the third. I halted, waited, watched. The conversation continued between the four men. It grew earnest. Backus drew gradually away. The gamblers followed and kept at his elbow. I was uncomfortable. However, as they passed me by presently, I heard Backus say with a tone of persecuted annoyance, "But it ain't any use, gentlemen. I'll tell you again, as I told you half a dozen times before, I warn't raised it, and ain't going to risk it." I felt relieved. His level head will be his sufficient protection, I said to myself. During the fortnight's run from Acapulco to San Francisco, I several times saw the gamblers talking earnestly with Backus, and once I threw out a gentle warning to him. He chuckled comfortably and said, "Oh, yes, they tag around after me considerable, want me to play a little, just for amusement, they say. But laws o' me, if my folks had told me once to look out for that sort of livestock, they told me 1,000 times, I reckon." By and by, in due course, we were approaching San Francisco. It was an ugly black night, with a strong wind blowing, but there was not much sea. I was on deck alone. Toward 10 I started below. A figure issued from the gambler's den and disappeared in the darkness. I experienced a shock, for I was sure it was Backus. I flew down the companionway, looked about for him, could not find him, then returned to the deck just in time to catch a glimpse of him as he re-entered that confounded nest of rascality. Had he yielded at last? I feared it. What had he gone below for? His bag of coin? Possibly. I drew near the door, full of bodings. It was a crack, and I glanced in and saw a sight that made me bitterly wish I'd given my attention to saving my poor cattle friend, instead of reading and dreaming my foolish time away. He was gambling. Worse still, he was being plied with champagne, and was already showing some effect from it. He praised the cider, as he called it, and said now that he had got a taste of it, he almost believed he'd drink it if it was spirits. It was so good, and so ahead of anything he'd ever run across before. Surreptitious smiles at this passed from one rascal to another, and they filled all the glasses, and while Bacchus honestly drained his to the bottom, they pretended to do the same, but threw the wine over their shoulders. I could not bear the scene, so I wandered forward and tried to interest myself in the sea and the voices of the wind. But no, my uneasy spirit kept dragging me back at quarter-hour intervals, and always I saw Bacchus drinking his wine, fairly and squarely, and the others throwing theirs away. It was the painfulest night I ever spent. The only hope I had was that we might reach our anchorage with speed. That would break up the game. I helped the ship along all I could with my prayers. At last we went booming through the Golden Gate, and my pulses leaped for joy. I hurried back to that door and glanced in. Alas, there was small room for hope. Bacchus's eyes were heavy and bloodshot. His sweaty face was crimson, his speech maudlin and thick, his body sawed drunkenly about with the weaving motion of the ship. He drained another glass to the dregs, while the cards were being dealt. He took his hand, glanced at it, and his dull eyes lit up for a moment. The gamblers observed it and showed their gratification by hardly perceptible signs. "How many cards?" "None," said Bacchus. One villain, named Hank Wiley, discarded one card, the others 3 each. The betting began. Heretofore, the bets had been trifling, $1 or 2. But Bacchus started off with an eagle now. Wiley hesitated a moment, then saw it, and went $10 better. The other 2 threw up their hands. Bacchus went 20 better. Wiley said, "I see that, and go you 100 better," then smiled and reached for the money. "Let it alone," said Bacchus with drunken gravity. "What, you mean to say you're going to cover it?" "Cover it? Well, I reckon I am. And lay another 100 on top of it, too." He reached down inside his overcoat and produced the required sum. "Ah, that's your little game, is it? I see you raise it 500, said Wiley. 500 better, said the foolish bull-driver, and pulled out the amount and showered it on the pile. The 3 conspirators hardly tried to conceal their exultation. All diplomacy and pretense were dropped now, and the sharp exclamations came thick and fast, and the yellow pyramid grew higher and higher. At last, $10,000 lay in view. Wiley cast a bag of coin on the table and said with mocking gentleness, $5,000 better, my friend from the rural districts. What do you say now?" "I call you," said Bacchus, heaving his golden shot bag on the pile. "What have you got?" "4 kings, you damned fool!" And Wiley threw down his cards and surrounded the stakes with his arms. "4 aces, you ass!" thundered Bacchus, covering this man with a cocked revolver. "I'm a professional gambler myself, and I've been laying for you duffers all this voyage." Down went the anchor, rumbledy-dum-dum, and the trip was ended. Well, well, it is a sad world. One of the 3 gamblers was Bacchus's pal. It was he that dealt the fateful hands. According to an understanding with the 2 victims, he was to have given Bacchus 4 queens, but alas, he didn't. A week later I stumbled upon Bacchus, arrayed in the height of fashion, in Montgomery Street. He said cheerily as we were parting, "Ah, by the way, you needn't mind about those gores. I don't really know anything about cattle, except what I was able to pick up a week's apprenticeship over in Jersey just before we sailed. My cattle culture and cattle enthusiasm have served their turn. I shan't need 'em any more. Next day we reluctantly parted from the Gold Dust and her officers, hoping to see that boat and all those officers again some day, a thing which the fates were to render tragically impossible. Chapter 37. The End of the Gold Dust. 3 months later, August 8th, while I was writing one of these foregoing chapters, the New York papers brought this telegram. A terrible disaster. 17 persons killed by an explosion on the steamer Gold Dust. Nashville, August 7th. A dispatch from Hickman, Kentucky, says, the steamer Gold Dust exploded her boilers at 3 o'clock today, just after leaving Hickman. 47 persons were scalded and 17 are missing. The boat was landed in the eddy just above the town, and through the exertions of the citizens, the cabin passengers, officers, and part of the crew and deck passengers were taken ashore and removed to the hotels and residences. 24 of the injured were lying in Holcomb's dry goods store at one time, where they received every attention before being removed to more comfortable places. A list of the names followed, whereby it appeared that of the 17 dead, 1 was the barkeeper, and among the 47 wounded were the captain, chief mate, second mate, and second and third clerks. Also Mr. Lemuel Gray, pilot, and several members of the crew. In answer to a private telegram, we learned that none of these was severely hurt except Mr. Gray. Letters received afterward confirmed this news and said that Mr. Gray was improving and would get well. Later letters spoke less hopefully of his case, and finally came one announcing his death. A good man, a most companionable and manly man, and worthy of a kindlier fate. Chapter 38. The House Beautiful. We took passage in a Cincinnati boat for New Orleans, or on a Cincinnati boat. Either is correct. The former is the eastern form of putting it, the latter the western. Mr. Dickens declined to agree that the Mississippi steamboats were magnificent, or that they were floating palaces, terms which had always been applied to them, terms which did not over-express the admiration with which the people viewed them. Mr. Dickens's position was unassailable, possibly. The people's position was certainly unassailable. If Mr. Dickens was comparing these boats with the Crown Jewels, or with the Taj, or with the Matterhorn, or with some other priceless or wonderful thing which he had seen, they were not magnificent. He was right. The people compared them with what they had seen, and thus measured, thus judged, the boats were magnificent. The term was the correct one. It was not at all too strong. The people were as right as was Mr. Dickens. Steamboats were finer than anything on shore. Compared with superior dwelling-houses and first-class hotels in the valley, they were indubitably magnificent. They were palaces. To a few people living in New Orleans and St. Louis they were not magnificent, perhaps, not palaces, but to the great majority of those populations, and to the entire populations spread over both banks between Baton Rouge and St. Louis, they were palaces. They tallied with the citizen's dream of what magnificence was, and satisfied it. Every town and village along that vast stretch of double river frontage had a best dwelling, finest dwelling, mansion, the home of its wealthiest and most conspicuous citizen. It was easy to describe it. Large grassy yard, with paling fence painted white, in fair repair. Brick walk from gate to door, big, square, 2-story frame house, painted white and porticoed like a Grecian temple, with this difference, that the imposing fluted columns and Corinthian capitals were a pathetic sham, being made of white pine and painted. Iron knocker, brass doorknob, discolored for lack of polishing. Within, an uncarpeted hall of planed boards. Opening out of it, a parlor, 15 feet by 15, in some instances 5 or 10 feet larger. Ingrain carpet, Mahogany center table, lamp on it with green paper shade, standing on a gridiron, so to speak, made of high-colored yarns by the young ladies of the house, and called a lamp mat. Several books, piled and disposed with cast-iron exactness, according to an inherited and unchangeable plan. Among them, Tupper, much penciled. Also, Friendship's Offering and Affection's Wreath, with their sappy inanities illustrated in die-away mezzotints. Also, Ossian, Alonzo and Melissa, maybe Ivanhoe. Also, Album, full of original poetry of the thou hast wounded the spirit that loved thee breed. 2 or 3 goody-goody works, Shepherd of Salisbury Plain, etc. Current number of the chaste and innocuous Godey's Ladies Book, with painted fashion plate of wax figure women with mouths all alike, lips and eyelids the same size, each 5-foot woman with a 2-inch wedge sticking from under her dress, and letting on to be half of her foot. Polished, airtight stove, new and deadly invention, with pipe passing through a board which closes up the discarded, good old fireplace. On each end of the wooden mantel, over the fireplace, a large basket of peaches and other fruits, natural size, all done in plaster, rudely, or in wax, and painted to resemble the originals, which they don't. Over middle of mantel, engraving, Washington crossing the Delaware. On the wall by the door, copy of it, done in thunder and lightning crewels by one of the young ladies, work of art, which would have made Washington hesitate about crossing, if he could have foreseen what advantage was going to be taken of it. Piano, kettle in disguise, with music, bound and unbound, piled on it. And on a stand nearby, Battle of Prague, Bird Waltz, Arkansas Traveler, Rosin the Bow, Marseillaise Hymn, On a Lone Barren Isle, St. Helena. The last link is broken. She wore a wreath of roses the night when we last met. Go forget me, why should sorrow o'er that brow a shadow fling? Hours that were to memory dearer. Long, long ago. Days of absence. A life on the ocean wave, a home on the rolling deep, bird at sea, and spread open on the rack where the plaintive singer had left it, row whole on silver Mohun, guide the traveler on his way, etc. Tilted pensively against the piano, a guitar. Guitar capable of playing the Spanish fandango by itself if you give it a start. Frantic work of art on the wall. Pious motto done on the premises, sometimes in colored yarns, sometimes in faded grasses, progenitor of the God Bless Our Home of modern commerce. Framed in black moldings on the wall, other works of art, conceived and committed on the premises by the young ladies, being grim black and white crayons, landscapes mostly, lake, solitary sailboat, petrified clouds, pre-geological trees on shore, anthracite precipice, name of criminal conspicuous in the corner. Lithograph, Napoleon crossing the Alps. Lithograph, the grave at St. Helena. Steel plates, Trumbull's Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Sally from Gibraltar. Copper plates, Moses smiting the rock, and Return of the Prodigal Son. In big gilt frame, Slander of the Family in oil. Papa holding a book, Constitution of the United States. Guitar leaning against Mama. Blue ribbons fluttering from its neck. The young ladies as children in slippers and scalloped pantalettes, one embracing toy horse, the other beguiling kitten with ball of yarn, and both simpering up at Mama, who simpers back. These persons all fresh, raw, and red, apparently skinned. Opposite, in gilt frame, Grandpa and Grandma, at 30 and 22, stiff, old-fashioned, high-collared, puff-sleeved, glaring pallidly out from a background of solid Egyptian night. Under a glass French clock dome, large bouquet of stiff flowers done in corpsey white wax. Pyramidal whatnot in corner, the shelves occupied chiefly with bric-a-brac of the period, disposed with an eye to the best effect. Shell, with the Lord's Prayer carved on it. Another shell, of the long oval sort, narrow straight orifice, 3 inches long, running from end to end. Portrait of Washington carved on it. Not well done. The shell had Washington's mouth originally. Artists should have built to that. These two are memorials of the long-ago bridal trip to New Orleans and the French market. Other bric-a-brac: Californian specimens, quartz with gold wart adhering, old guinea gold locket with circlet of ancestral hair in it, Indian arrowheads of flint, pair of bead moccasins from uncle who crossed the plains, 3 alum baskets of various colors, being skeleton frame of wire, clothed on with cubes of crystallized alum in the rock candy style, works of art which were achieved by the young ladies. Their doubles and duplicates to be found upon all whatnots in the land. Convention of desiccated bugs and butterflies pinned to a card. Painted toy dog seated upon bellows attachment. Drops its under jaw and squeaks when pressed upon. Sugar candy rabbit, limbs and features merged together, not strongly defined. Pewter presidential campaign medal. Miniature cardboard wood sawyer to be attached to the stovepipe and operated by the heat. Small Napoleon done in wax. Spread open daguerreotypes of dim children, parents, cousins, aunts, and friends in all attitudes but customary ones. No templed portico at back, and manufactured landscape stretching away in the distance that came in later with the photograph. All these vague figures, lavishly chained and ringed, metal indicated and secured from doubt by stripes and splashes of vivid gold bronze, all of them too much combed, too much fixed up, and all of them uncomfortable in inflexible Sunday clothes of a pattern which the spectator cannot realize could ever have been in fashion. Husband and wife generally grouped together, husband sitting, wife standing, with hand on his shoulder, and both preserving, all these fading years, some traceable effect of the daguerreotypist's brisk, "Now smile if you please," bracketed over the whatnot, place of special sacredness, an outrage in watercolor, done by the young niece that came on a visit long ago and died. Pity, too, for she might have repented of this in time. Horsehair chairs, horsehair sofa which keeps sliding from under you, window shades of oil stuff with milkmaids and ruined castles stenciled on them in fierce colors, lambrequins dependent from gaudy boxings of beaten tin, gilded, bedrooms with rag carpets, bedsteads of the corded sort with a sag in the middle, the cords needing tightening, snuffy feather bed, not aired often enough, cane seat chairs, splint-bottomed rocker, looking-glass on wall, school slate size, veneered frame, inherited bureau, washbowl and pitcher possibly, but not certainly, brass candlestick, tallow candle, snuffers, nothing else in the room, not a bathroom in the house, and no visitor likely to come along who has ever seen one. That was the residence of the principal citizen, all the way from the suburbs of New Orleans to the edge of St. Louis. When he stepped aboard a big, fine steamboat, he entered a new and marvelous world. Chimney tops cut to counterfeit a spraying crown of plumes and maybe painted red. Pilot house, hurricane deck, boiler deck guards, all garnished with white wooden filigree work of fanciful patterns, gilt acorns topping the derricks, gilt deer horns over the big bell, gaudy symbolical picture on the paddle box, possibly, big roomy boiler deck painted blue and furnished with Windsor armchairs. Inside, a far receding snow-white cabin, porcelain knob and oil picture on every stateroom door, curving patterns of filigree work touched up with gilding, stretching overhead all down the converging vista. Big chandeliers every little way, each an April shower of glittering glass drops. Lovely rainbow light falling everywhere from the colored glazing of the skylights. The whole a long-drawn, resplendent tunnel, a bewildering and soul-satisfying spectacle. In the ladies' cabin a pink and white Wilton carpet, as soft as mush, and glorified with a ravishing pattern of gigantic flowers. Then the bridal chamber. The animal that invented that idea was still alive and unhanged at that day. Bridal chamber whose pretentious flummery was necessarily overawing to the now tottering intellect of that hosannaing citizen. Every stateroom had its couple of cozy, clean bunks, and perhaps a looking-glass and a snug closet, and sometimes there was even a wash-bowl and pitcher and part of a towel which could be told from mosquito-netting by an expert. Though generally these things were absent, and the shirt-sleeved passengers cleansed themselves at a long row of stationary bowls in the barber shop, where were also public towels, public combs, and public soap. Take the steamboat which I have just described, and you have her in her highest and finest and most pleasing and comfortable and satisfactory estate. Now, cake her over with a layer of ancient and obdurate dirt, and you have the Cincinnati steamer a while ago referred to. Not all over, only inside, for she was ably officered in all departments except the steward's. But wash that boat and repaint her, and she would be about the counterpart of the most complimented boat of the old flush times, for the steamboat architecture of the West had undergone no change. Neither has steamboat furniture and ornamentation undergone any. Chapter 39. Manufactures and Miscreants. Where the river, in the Vicksburg region, used to be corkscrewed, it is now comparatively straight, made so by cut-off. A former distance of 70 miles is reduced to 35. It is a change which threw Vicksburg's neighbor, Delta, Louisiana, out into the country and ended its career as a river town. Its whole river frontage is now occupied by a vast sandbar, thickly covered with young trees, a growth which will magnify itself into a dense forest by and completely hide the exiled town. In due time we passed Grand Gulf and Rodney of war fame and reached Natchez, the last of the beautiful hill cities, for Baton Rouge, yet to come, is not on a hill, but only on high ground. Famous Natchez under the hill has not changed notably in 20 years. In outward aspect, judging by the descriptions of the ancient procession of foreign tourists, it has not changed in 60, for it is still small, straggling, and shabby. It had a desperate reputation, morally, in the old keel-boating and early steamboating times, plenty of drinking, carousing, fisticuffing, and killing there, among the riffraff of the river in those days. But Natchez on top of the hill is attractive, has always been attractive. Even Mrs. Trollope, 1827, had to confess its charms. At 1 or 2 points, the wearisome level line is relieved by bluffs, as they call the short intervals of high ground. The town of Natchez is beautifully situated on one of those high spots. The contrast that its bright green hill forms with the dismal line of black forest that stretches on every side, the abundant growth of the pawpaw, palmetto, and orange, the copious variety of sweet-scented flowers that flourish there, all makes it appear like an oasis in the desert. Natchez is the furthest point to the north at which oranges ripen in the open air, or endure the winter without shelter. With the exception of this sweet spot, I thought all the little towns and villages we passed wretched-looking in the extreme. Natchez, like her near and far river neighbors, has railways now and is adding to them, pushing them hither and thither into all rich outlying regions that are naturally tributary to her. And like Vicksburg and New Orleans, she has her ice factory. She makes 30 tons of ice a day. In Vicksburg and Natchez, in my time, ice was jewelry. None but the rich could wear it. But anybody and everybody can have it now. I visited one of the ice factories in New Orleans to see what the polar regions might look like when lugged into the edge of the tropics. But there was nothing striking in the aspect of the place. It was merely a spacious house, with some innocent steam machinery in one end of it, and some big porcelain pipes running here and there. No, not porcelain. They merely seemed to be. They were iron, but the ammonia which was being breathed through them had coated them to the thickness of your hand with solid, milk-white ice. It ought to have melted, for one did not require winter clothing in that atmosphere, but it did not melt, The inside of the pipe was too cold. Sunk into the floor were numberless tin boxes, a foot square and 2 feet long, and open at the top end. These were full of clear water, and around each box salt and other proper stuff was packed. Also, the ammonia gases were applied to the water in some way which will always remain a secret to me, because I was not able to understand the process.